My daughter died 8 years ago in a crash that left me with a scarred wrist and a shattered heart. Every year since I handed her husband $50,000 to ensure my granddaughter received the best medical care, I believed I was buying her a future. One Sunday, my 10-year-old granddaughter grabbed my sleeve and whispered a warning. "Grandpa, do not give Dad any more money. Just follow him. You will see." What I uncovered terrified me. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to uncover a painful truth to protect the ones you love. My name is Tyrone Mitchell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and a man who spent his entire life building foundations meant to last. But the foundation of my family was secretly rotting away. I sat at the heavy oak dining table in my Atlanta home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished wood. Bradley stood across from me. He wore a crisp navy suit that cost more than my first truck. He was a hedge fund manager, a man who traded invisible numbers for a living. I slid the certified bank check across the table. $50,000. The ink was barely dry. Bradley picked it up without a word of genuine gratitude. He flicked the paper with his index finger and sighed heavily. "Tyrone, you have no idea how fast this goes," he complained, pacing the length of my kitchen. "Harper has severe asthma. The specialist visits alone drain my accounts. The experimental treatments are climbing every quarter. I just want my little girl to breathe easily." I nodded slowly. I always nodded. I looked down at my left wrist and traced the thick, jagged scar running up my forearm. The scar throbbed whenever the weather turned cold. It also throbbed whenever I looked at Bradley. 8 years ago, metal crushed bone on a rain-slicked highway. I survived the wreck. My daughter, Aaliyah, did not. I was driving. The guilt weighed heavier than any steel beam I ever hoisted during my 40 years in construction. Giving Bradley this money every year was my penance. It was my duty to ensure Aaliyah's child never lacked anything. Bradley's phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He glanced at the screen and his expression tightened. "I have to take this," he muttered, already walking toward the sliding glass door. "A major client is having a meltdown." He stepped out onto the patio and slid the glass door shut behind him. The thick glass muffled his voice. I remained at the table. Harper sat on the living room rug. She was 10 years old, small for her age, with Aaliyah's dark, soulful eyes. She clutched a worn-out stuffed bear. Harper did not look like a child whose father managed millions of dollars. Her clothes were clean but faded. Her sneakers were scuffed at the toes. She stood up silently and walked into the kitchen. She did not make a sound. She stopped right beside my chair. She kept her head down, staring intensely at the floorboards. Her tiny fingers reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my flannel shirt. She squeezed the fabric with a desperate, trembling force. "Grandpa, do not give Dad any more money," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath. It was fragile and terrified. I frowned and leaned forward. "Harper, what are you talking about?" I asked gently. She did not look up. She kept her eyes glued to the wood beneath her frayed shoes. "Just follow him," she whispered, her grip tightening on my sleeve until her knuckles turned pale. "Follow him. You will see." Before I could ask another question, the heavy glass door slid open with a violent scrape. Bradley marched back into the kitchen. He shoved his phone into his pocket. His face was flushed with sudden anger. He saw Harper standing close to me, and his demeanor instantly shifted. The polite, concerned father vanished. A cold, hard edge replaced his polished smile. "Harper, what are you doing bothering your grandfather?" he snapped. He crossed the kitchen in 3 wide strides. He grabbed Harper by the upper arm. His grip was rough and unforgiving. She flinched and pulled her shoulders up to her ears. "We have to go," Bradley announced, glaring at me. "She needs her medication immediately. Her breathing is getting shallow." I stood up from my chair. I looked closely at Harper. She was not wheezing. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, calm rhythm. There was no asthma attack happening. "Bradley, she looks fine," I said. "Let the girl sit for a minute. We were just talking." Bradley did not loosen his grip on her arm. "I know my daughter's medical needs, Tyrone," he said sharply. "I am her father. You are just her grandfather. We are leaving." He dragged her toward the front hallway. Harper stumbled, trying to keep up with his aggressive pace. She did not cry. She did not protest. She simply went completely limp, submitting to his physical dominance. She looked over her shoulder just before Bradley pulled her out the front door. The absolute terror in her eyes struck me like a physical blow. She was a hostage, not a cherished daughter. The heavy front door slammed shut. The noise echoed through my empty house. I stood alone in the kitchen. The silence pressed against my eardrums. My mind raced through the brief, chilling interaction. I spent decades inspecting buildings for structural failure. I knew how to identify stress fractures hidden beneath fresh paint. I knew how to spot a foundation that was silently crumbling into the earth. I had just witnessed a massive structural failure in my own family. Aaliyah's husband was hiding something monumental. The $50,000 I just handed him was not paying for inhalers or specialist visits. My granddaughter was living in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. I walked over to the kitchen window and watched his luxury SUV pull out of my driveway. The tires spun aggressively against the asphalt. He drove away far too fast for a man supposedly transporting a child in medical distress. I touched the scar on my wrist again. The guilt that usually pacified me vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Bradley believed I was just a tired old man consumed by grief. He believed I would simply write checks and ask no questions. He severely underestimated the man he was dealing with. A structural engineer does not ignore a crack in the wall. He rips open the drywall to find the source of the rot. I walked to the coat rack and grabbed my keys. I had a promise to keep to my dead daughter. I was going to follow him. I was going to see exactly where my money went. And I was going to tear his entire world apart piece by piece. I knew the journey ahead would test every ounce of strength I possessed, but I was ready for the war that was coming. I grabbed the keys to my old Ford pickup truck. The engine rumbled to life with a familiar reliability that always brought me comfort. I kept 2 cars behind Bradley's sleek black luxury vehicle as we navigated the congested streets of suburban Atlanta. He merged onto the interstate, heading straight into the heart of the city. We were nowhere near the pediatric respiratory clinic he had mentioned. The clinic was located 15 miles in the opposite direction. Bradley took the exit for an area defined by luxury high-rises and exclusive corporate suites. I kept my distance and watched him pull into a private parking garage reserved for executives. I parked my battered truck across the street from a gleaming glass and steel tower. Bradley handed his keys to a valet and strode inside with the arrogant posture of a man who owned the pavement beneath his expensive Italian shoes. I crossed the street, mingling with the midday foot traffic. I spent 40 years of my life working as a structural engineer. My job was to calculate the exact load-bearing capacity of concrete and steel. I spent decades studying blueprints looking for microscopic fractures that could bring a 60-story building crashing to the ground. You learn a lot about physics in that line of work. You learn even more about patience. You learn how to stand perfectly still and observe stress points without making a single sound. A weak foundation always shows signs of buckling before the entire structure fails. I applied that exact same discipline as I positioned myself near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the real estate brokerage on the ground level. I adjusted my flat cap and pretended to read a financial flyer posted on the exterior glass. My eyes remained fixed on the interior of the office. Inside the opulent room, Bradley was not negotiating medical bills or pleading with doctors for his sick child. He sat in a plush leather chair across from a senior real estate broker. A sprawling architectural model of a commercial complex sat on the table between them. Next to Bradley sat a young white woman. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and wore a tailored cream designer suit. Her name, as I would soon discover, was Victoria. Bradley leaned in close to her. He whispered something in her ear. She laughed brightly and touched his arm. Their intimacy was undeniable and repulsive to witness. The broker slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany desk. Bradley signed the papers with a dramatic flourish. The broker shook Bradley's hand and congratulated him warmly. I could read the bold print on the cover sheet facing the window. It was a commercial property acquisition agreement. The purchase price was clearly visible, $2 million. The money I handed him that morning, the $50,000 meant for my granddaughter's failing lungs, was just a drop in the ocean of his massive hidden wealth. But the money was not what made my blood run cold. Victoria reached across the table to pick up a complimentary glass of champagne. As she raised her arm, her blazer sleeve slipped backward. A flash of deep, vibrant green caught the bright fluorescent office lights. My heart slammed against my ribs. I completely stopped breathing. It was an antique jade bracelet carved with distinct interlocking lotus vines. It was a very specific custom piece I had commissioned for my daughter Aaliyah on her 21st birthday. I remembered the exact weight of that cool stone in my palm. I remembered slipping it onto Aaliyah's wrist and seeing her beautiful smile. And I remembered the horrific rainy afternoon 8 years ago when I stood over Aaliyah's open casket. I had personally placed that exact jade bracelet on my dead daughter's cold wrist before the mortician sealed the lid. I watched the earth swallow that coffin. The bracelet was supposed to remain in the ground with my only child for eternity. Now that sacred heirloom circled the wrist of the woman sitting next to my son-in-law. The dark implications crushed the breath out of my lungs. Bradley had not just moved on with a secret lover. He had desecrated my daughter's grave, or he had stolen the jewelry from her mangled body before she was even put into the ground. He had taken a precious family heirloom and gifted it to his mistress. The pure malice of that act defied all human comprehension. A burning, violent rage flared in my chest. My hands balled into tight fists. I wanted to smash through the heavy glass storefront. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and squeeze until he confessed everything he had done to my family. I wanted to tear that bracelet off her wrist and demand answers. But my engineering instincts overrode my blinding grief. A structural collapse requires a systematic, controlled approach. If I confronted him right now, he would deny everything. He would use his wealth, his influence, and his high-priced lawyers to bury me in court. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I raised the camera, steadying my trembling hands with deliberate focus. I aimed the lens directly at Victoria's wrist through the thick glass. I zoomed in to capture the unmistakable lotus carving on the jade. Just as my finger hovered over the capture button, a heavy hand tapped my shoulder. I spun around abruptly. A large, uniformed security guard stood inches from my face. He had a stern expression and his hand rested dangerously near his radio. "Sir, you cannot loiter here," the guard stated firmly. "You are making the clients inside uncomfortable. I advise you to move along right now before I call the police." I glanced back through the window. Bradley had turned his head toward the commotion outside. He was looking directly at the glass pane. He had not spotted my face yet, but Victoria was pointing toward the window with her champagne glass. If I stayed even one more second, Bradley would see me spying on him. My element of surprise would vanish instantly. The entire advantage of a silent adjustment relies on the enemy believing they hold all the power and control. I lowered my phone and nodded to the guard. "I apologize," I said, keeping my voice exceptionally low and respectful. "I was just admiring the architecture of the building. Have a good day." I turned and walked away at a measured, unhurried pace. I did not run. I blended back into the busy Atlanta sidewalk crowd, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my sternum. I reached my truck, climbed inside, and locked the doors. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. The image of that green stone burned deeply into my mind. Bradley was funding a multi-million-dollar empire with my money. He was abusing my frightened granddaughter. He was parading a mistress draped in my dead daughter's sacred jewelry. I put the truck in gear and pulled out into the heavy city traffic. I drove back toward my empty house. I did not know the full extent of his criminal operation yet, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going to systematically tear his foundation apart brick by brick. I was going to take everything he valued. The war had just escalated, and Bradley had absolutely no idea the level of destruction that was coming for him. I drove back to my house with my mind racing. The image of the jade bracelet burned behind my eyes. Aaliyah's bracelet. I had buried her with it. The implications were too horrific to fully process while navigating the busy highway. I needed to plan. I needed to understand exactly what Bradley was doing and how he had done it. But my structural engineer's mind knew that gathering data was only the first step. You had to test the materials. You had to see how they reacted under stress. Bradley had presented a flawless facade for 8 years. I needed to find a crack. I had barely pulled into my driveway when my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. The screen displayed Bradley's name. I took a deep breath. I let it ring 3 times. A frantic mind makes mistakes. I answered on the 4th ring. "Tyrone, I need your help," Bradley said. His voice was breathless and urgent. It was a perfect performance of a terrified father. "Harper just had a massive asthma attack. We are at the clinic now. Her regular inhalers are not working." I gripped the steering wheel. I knew this was a lie. I had just watched him sign a $2 million commercial property contract with his mistress. Harper was not having an asthma attack. She was likely locked in an attic somewhere or sitting quietly in a car while her father orchestrated his next financial maneuver. "What do the doctors say?" I asked. I kept my voice steady and concerned. They are recommending an experimental biologic treatment, Bradley replied quickly. It is highly effective but completely uncovered by my insurance. They need an upfront payment before they even start the IV. I do not have that kind of liquid cash right now, Tyrone. I need $20,000 immediately. I stared through the windshield at my empty front porch. The audacity of his demand was staggering. He had just collected a $50,000 check from me 3 hours ago. Now he wanted another $20,000. He was bleeding me dry, testing the limits of my guilt and my love for Harper. I decided to apply a little pressure to the foundation of his lie. I do not think I can authorize a wire transfer that large right now, Bradley, I said slowly. The bank requires a 24-hour hold on amounts over $10,000 to prevent fraud, especially for international or unusual medical accounts. I can try to go down to the branch tomorrow morning and speak with the manager directly. The silence on the other line was immediate and heavy. The concerned father act vanished instantly. When Bradley spoke again, his voice was no longer breathless. It was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. Tomorrow morning might be too late, Tyrone, he said. His tone carried a veiled threat. If you cannot help me secure her health here, I will have to consider other options. The specialists have mentioned a long-term pediatric facility in Colorado. They have an excellent experimental program. But if I move her there, the distance will make visitation extremely difficult for you. I know how much you value seeing her. The threat was clear and absolute. Pay the $20,000 or lose access to your granddaughter permanently. He was using Harper as leverage. He knew the scar on my wrist was an open wound. He knew I would do anything to keep Aaliyah's child close to me. He was extorting me with surgical precision. I understand the urgency, Bradley, I replied. My voice remained remarkably calm despite the violent anger surging through my veins. I will call my private broker. I can authorize an emergency release of funds from a secondary account. It will cost me a penalty fee, but I can have the $20,000 wired to your primary account within the hour. The relief in his voice was palpable, but it was not the relief of a father saving his child. It was the satisfaction of a con artist securing another payout. Thank you, Tyrone, he said smoothly. I knew I could count on you. Harper is going to be fine. I will let you know when she is stable. He disconnected the call. I sat in the cab of my truck. I pulled up my banking app on my phone. I initiated the transfer of $20,000 to Bradley's account. I watched the progress bar complete. The funds were gone. To any outside observer, I had just succumbed to extortion. I had just funded a man who was stealing from me and parading my dead daughter's jewelry on another woman's wrist. But I viewed the transaction differently. In structural engineering, sometimes you have to inject a tracing die into a cracked foundation to see exactly where the water is leaking. That $20,000 was my tracing die. I was not buying Harper's imaginary asthma treatment. I was buying time. I was buying the illusion of my own compliance. Bradley now believed he had complete control over me. He believed I was a gullible, grieving old man who would blindly sign checks whenever he threatened to take Harper away. He felt secure in his deception. That false sense of security was the exact vulnerability I needed to exploit. I walked into my house. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the quiet emptiness of a widower's home. It was the silence before a controlled demolition. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a heavy fireproof lockbox. I carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were rows of meticulously organized files. Birth certificates, deeds, insurance policies, and Evelyn's old financial records. Evelyn had always been the meticulous one. She possessed a terrifying intellect when it came to numbers. She could spot a discrepancy in a spreadsheet from across the room. I needed her expertise now more than ever. I needed to understand the financial web Bradley was weaving. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. Oliver Vance. Oliver was a former forensic accountant who had turned to private investigation after uncovering a massive embezzlement scheme that cost him his corporate career. Evelyn had recommended him to several clients before she passed. He was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely discreet. Oliver answered on the second ring. Tyrone, he said. His voice was gravelly and unhurried. It has been a long time. I was sorry to hear about Evelyn. I appreciated the sentiment, but I had no time for pleasantries. I need your help, Oliver, I said directly. I suspect my son-in-law is engaged in massive financial fraud. He is extorting me using my granddaughter's health as leverage, and I believe he is funding a commercial real estate empire with the money. Oliver did not express shock or offer platitudes. He simply asked for the parameters of the job. What exactly do you need me to find? He asked. I need you to track two specific transfers, I replied. $50,000 handed over as a certified check this morning and a $20,000 wire transfer completed 10 minutes ago. I need to know exactly which accounts those funds land in, what corporate entities control those accounts, and every asset tied to those entities. I also need you to locate his secondary residence. He just signed a $2 million commercial contract with a woman named Victoria. I need to know who she is and where they are keeping my granddaughter. There was a brief pause on the line. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. Send me the account numbers and the transaction IDs, Oliver instructed. If he is moving that kind of capital into commercial real estate, he is using a shell company. I will tear it apart. I will have an initial report for you by tomorrow evening. I hung up the phone. The $20,000 was already moving through the banking system, tracing the exact path of Bradley's corruption. I looked at the framed photograph of Aaliyah on the mantel. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a future that had been brutally stolen from her. I touched the scar on my wrist one last time. The guilt was gone. The sorrow was replaced by a cold, devastating focus. Bradley had built a fortress of lies using my money and my grief as the mortar. He thought he was untouchable. He did not realize that I possessed the exact blueprints to his destruction. I was going to locate the structural flaws in his empire. I was going to place the charges precisely where they would cause the most catastrophic damage. And I was going to bring his entire world crashing down around him. The demolition had officially begun. I met Oliver Vance the following evening at a deserted diner on the outskirts of Atlanta. The flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a harsh red glow across the sticky laminate table. Oliver slid a thin manila folder toward me. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me Bradley owned a secondary property registered under the same corporate shell company we had identified earlier. It was a secluded Victorian-style house sitting on 2 acres of heavily wooded land in Milton. Oliver noted that Bradley rarely visited the property during daylight hours. Victoria spent most of her time there. The utility bills showed minimal power usage for a house of that massive size. That specific detail bothered my structural engineering mind. A large house with a remarkably low electrical footprint meant entire sections of it were intentionally powered down to avoid detection. I paid Oliver in cash and memorized the address. I needed to see the property with my own eyes to understand the true nature of this hidden fortress. I arrived in Milton just past midnight. The affluent neighborhood was completely silent, dominated by sprawling brick estates hidden behind wrought iron gates and towering privacy hedges. I parked my battered truck 3 blocks away to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention to my arrival. I walked the rest of the distance through the deep shadows. The crisp night air bit harshly through my heavy jacket. I approached Bradley's secondary property from the dense tree line at the rear of the estate. The house was an imposing structure. The lower floors were completely dark, secured by heavy deadbolts and tightly drawn blinds. However, a faint, sickly yellow light spilled from a single circular window at the very top of the house. The attic. I stood still in the frozen grass and studied the exterior architecture. 40 years of inspecting commercial buildings trained my eyes to find structural pathways where others only saw solid walls. I identified a reinforced cast-iron drainage pipe secured to the brick facade by heavy steel brackets. It ran directly upward, passing a sturdy balcony ledge that provided access to the sloped slate roof. I am 70 years old, but my physical grip remains incredibly strong. I pulled myself up the cold iron pipe. My shoulders burned with the immense physical effort. I tested every single steel bracket before applying my full body weight. I reached the balcony, hoisted my body over the ornate iron railing, and carefully climbed onto the freezing slate roof. I crawled slowly on my hands and knees until I reached the small circular window. I peered through the dirty glass. The sight inside drove a physical spike of sheer agony straight into my chest. The attic was completely unfinished. Exposed wooden beams and pink fiberglass insulation lined the bare walls. There was absolutely no heating vent in the freezing room. Harper sat huddled on a bare, stained mattress shoved into the darkest corner. She wore a ragged, oversized gray sweater that swallowed her small frame entirely. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, visibly shivering in the cold air. A dented metal tray rested on the dusty floorboards next to her. It contained a cold, half-eaten can of soup and a cheap plastic spoon. This was where my $50,000 a year had actually gone. Bradley had deliberately locked his own daughter in a freezing, unfinished attic while he purchased million-dollar commercial properties with his mistress. My granddaughter was being treated like a prisoner of war in her own family. I pulled my smartphone from my front pocket. I activated the high-definition camera and pressed the red record button. I aimed the lens directly through the glass, ensuring the focus captured the stark reality of the room. The heavy wooden door on the far side of the attic suddenly swung open with a violent crash. Victoria marched into the room. She wore a thick, luxurious cashmere robe and held a steaming mug of gourmet tea. The absolute contrast between her opulent warmth and Harper's freezing misery made my blood boil with unprecedented fury. Victoria kicked the metal tray, sending the plastic spoons skittering across the filthy floorboards. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my trembling granddaughter. "You are entirely useless," Victoria snapped. Her voice was sharp, cruel, and vicious, echoing loudly off the exposed wooden beams. "I told you to scrub these floorboards before I came back upstairs. If Bradley sees this disgusting mess, he will lock you in the basement next time." Harper flinched violently and scrambled to her bare feet. She grabbed a dirty rag and dropped to her knees, scrubbing the wood with terrified, frantic movements. I gripped my phone tighter, ensuring I captured every single syllable of Victoria's horrible abuse. I finally had the undeniable proof I needed to destroy them both permanently. Then a catastrophic error occurred. I had forgotten to activate the silent mode on my mobile device. It was a glaring oversight caused by my blinding emotional rage. My phone vibrated violently against my palm with an incoming notification. The mechanical buzz resonated loudly against the thin, cold window pane. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere inside the attic like a gunshot. Victoria stopped mid-sentence. She snapped her head toward the circular window. Her eyes locked directly onto my dark silhouette crouching in the night. "Who is out there?" she shrieked, dropping her steaming mug onto the floorboards. I shoved the phone deep into my jacket pocket. I did not have the necessary time to climb down the iron pipe safely. I slid backward down the steep incline of the slate roof. My heavy boots slipped over the edge of the aluminum gutter. I pushed myself firmly away from the solid brick wall and plummeted backward into the freezing darkness. I crashed heavily into the thick evergreen bushes below. Stiff branches whipped across my face and tore violently at my clothes. The sudden impact knocked all the oxygen directly out of my lungs. I rolled off the crushed shrubbery and hit the damp earth hard. A flash of white-hot pain flared sharp through my left shoulder. I completely ignored the agonizing sensation. Basic survival instantly overrides physical pain. A bright, blinding beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness above my position. Victoria had thrown open the attic window and was rapidly sweeping a high-powered tactical flashlight across the expansive backyard. I pressed my entire body flat against the freezing soil. I controlled my breathing, forcing silent, shallow inhalations to avoid making a single sound. The intense beam of light washed over the bushes just inches from my head. I remained perfectly still, merging with the shadows. Decades of working on highly unstable, dangerous construction sites taught me exactly how to blend into the environment during a sudden emergency. Victoria cursed loudly and aggressively into the cold night air. Finding absolutely nothing, she slammed the heavy window shut. I waited patiently until I heard the solid metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I crawled forward on my forearms and knees until I reached the safety of the dense tree line. I stood up and navigated the heavily wooded path back to the main road. I walked the 3 long blocks to my truck with a severe, painful limp. I climbed into the driver's seat and immediately locked the heavy doors. My left shoulder throbbed relentlessly, but my mind was completely and utterly clear. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the digital recording. The audio was remarkably crisp. The visual evidence of Victoria actively abusing Harper was absolutely undeniable. Bradley's entire criminal operation relied heavily on extreme secrecy and the flawless illusion of my total compliance. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just an ignorant, grieving old man, blindly writing enormous checks to ease a guilty conscience. He was completely wrong. The fundamental rules of the game had officially changed. I now possessed the structural blueprint to his fraudulent, twisted empire. I held the specific weapon necessary to trigger the legal mechanism Evelyn had so brilliantly left behind for me. I started the engine of my battered truck. The deep roar of the exhaust shattered the quiet suburban silence. I put the vehicle in gear and drove away into the night, meticulously preparing to unleash absolute, unmitigated devastation upon the arrogant man who had maliciously imprisoned my innocent granddaughter. The time for silent observation was officially over. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the harsh glare of flashing red and blue lights sliced through the quiet interior of my living room. I had not slept a single minute since returning from the Milton property. I was mentally calculating the trajectory of my counteroffensive when a heavy knocking rattled my front door. I stood up, ignoring the lingering ache in my left shoulder from the fall into the evergreen bushes. I walked to the foyer and pulled open the heavy oak door. 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch looking at me with caution. "Tyrone Mitchell," the older officer asked. His tone was measured. I confirmed my identity without raising my voice. The officer stepped forward and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. He informed me that I was being served with an emergency restraining order. The name on the very top line belonged to Bradley. Bradley had moved with terrifying speed overnight. He had weaponized the local legal system to construct a barricade around himself and his fraudulent empire. The petition claimed I was suffering from severe dementia. It painted a fabricated picture of a grieving grandfather who had lost his grip on reality. Bradley accused me of exhibiting dangerous stalking behavior. He cited my sudden appearance outside his commercial real estate office as absolute proof of my supposed unhinged fixation. The petition officially declared me a direct and physical threat to the safety and the welfare of my granddaughter, Harper. The younger officer instructed me to step back and keep my hands clearly visible. He explained that due to the severe allegations regarding a minor child, they must escort me to the precinct for processing. They expected me to argue. They expected the panicked reaction of an old man losing his mind. That is what Bradley had primed them to anticipate. He wanted me to yell to resist, to prove his fabricated narrative on my front porch. I did not give them that satisfaction. I remained perfectly still. I placed my hands calmly by my sides. I agreed to accompany them without protest. During my 40 years working as a structural engineer, I managed dozens of catastrophic building failures. I stood in the rubble of collapsed high-rises and inspected steel bridges that had buckled under pressure. The fundamental rule of surviving a structural collapse is absolute emotional control. Panic accelerates collapse. When a support beam snaps, screaming does not stop the concrete from falling. You must evaluate the load distribution, identify the remaining stable supports, and move with deliberate precision. I applied that exact discipline to this legal ambush. Bradley had dropped a concrete slab onto my life, attempting to crush me under the weight of the law. I refused to buckle. I surrendered to the police peacefully. I locked my front door, walked down the steps, and climbed into the back of the cruiser with my head held high. I knew any display of anger would become ammunition for Bradley's lawyers. The ride to the precinct was entirely silent. I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood blur past the reinforced window. I compartmentalized my rage. I filed it away in a secure vault within my mind, saving it for the moment when it would cause the maximum damage to my enemy. We arrived at the police station and they led me into a sterile interrogation room. A detective entered shortly after. He was a weary-looking man carrying another thick file. He sat across from me at the metal table. He did not treat me like a hardened criminal. He treated me like a fragile, confused senior citizen. He explained the parameters of the emergency order. Bradley had requested a temporary suspension of all my visitation rights. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Harper Bradley or their properties. The trap was intricate and ruthlessly efficient. The detective leaned forward and delivered the final devastating blow of Bradley's legal strategy. Because the restraining order hinged on severe allegations of mental deterioration and child endangerment, the family court had mandated an immediate psychological evaluation. I was officially ordered to undergo a comprehensive cognitive and psychiatric assessment within 48 hours. The detective explained the stakes with a somber expression. This evaluation was not a mere formality. It was the absolute linchpin of Bradley's entire offensive maneuver against me. If the court-appointed psychiatrist found any merit to Bradley's fabricated claims, the emergency order would become permanent immediately. But the consequences extended far beyond losing access to my granddaughter forever. If I failed that psychological evaluation, Bradley would gain the ultimate leverage. He would use the official medical finding to petition the state for complete legal conservatorship over my life. He intended to strip away my autonomy entirely. The sheer scale of his calculated malice crystallized perfectly in my mind. Bradley was not simply trying to keep me away from Harper so he could continue his physical and emotional abuse in absolute secret. He was actively executing a hostile takeover of my entire existence. If he successfully secured conservatorship, he would gain total legal grounds to forcefully place me in a state-run assisted living facility. He would lock me away in a sterile room heavily medicated and completely isolated from the outside world. Once I was fully incapacitated and legally institutionalized, Bradley would assume total legal control of my entire estate. He would seize my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my home. He would drain my life savings to further fund his fraudulent commercial real estate ventures with Victoria. He was trying to erase me from the world and steal my legacy to finance his betrayal. The detective asked if I understood the severity of the situation. I looked him directly in the eyes. My gaze was clear, unwavering, and entirely lucid. I told him I understood perfectly. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of fear. I politely requested to use my one phone call. The detective agreed and slid a heavy landline phone across the metal table. I dialed the private number for Oliver Vance. I did not call him to secure a defense attorney. I did not need a lawyer to tell me how to fight a lie. I needed Oliver to continue tracing the money. Bradley had initiated a legal war, but the battlefield was entirely built on financial fraud. The psychological evaluation was merely a distraction. It was a smokescreen designed to keep me defending my sanity while he liquidated my assets and expanded his shell companies. I spoke to Oliver in a low, even tone. I instructed him to ignore the police involvement entirely. I told him to focus his forensic accounting skills on the $20,000 wire transfer. Bradley assumed I would spend the next 2 days terrified of losing my mind and freedom. He assumed the courts would force me into submission. He was fundamentally incorrect. I knew exactly how to pass a psychological evaluation. The legal ambush did not break my resolve. I would walk into that office and dismantle their tests with the precision of an engineer. The war was underway. The court-appointed psychiatrist sat across from me in an office completely devoid of natural light. Dr. Aris was a man who made his living categorizing the slow deterioration of the human mind. He placed a blank sheet of paper on his desk and asked me to draw a clock face reading exactly 10 minutes past 11. I did not simply draw a crude circle with jagged hands. I drafted a perfect mechanical schematic of a gear-driven timepiece. I explained the specific load distribution of the mainspring and the precise mathematical ratio required to keep the escapement wheel ticking accurately. Dr. Aris lowered his pen and stared at my drawing in silence. He asked me a series of complex memory recall questions designed to trip up a failing mind. I answered every query with cold precision. I recounted the date of my engineering licensure, the specific tensile strength of industrial rebar, and the sequential events of the morning my daughter died. I did not show anger. I did not show sorrow. I showed him the immaculate structured architecture of a fully lucid mind. After 45 minutes, Dr. Aris closed his thick leather binder. He informed me that I possessed absolute cognitive clarity. He stated he would immediately file a report to the family court dismissing Bradley's allegations as entirely baseless. The legal trap Bradley laid to secure my conservatorship shattered before it could deploy. I thanked the doctor and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. My autonomy remained intact. I drove my truck to a secluded park on the outskirts of the city. Oliver Vance was already waiting on a wooden bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He did not offer a handshake or a comforting smile. He simply patted a thick manila folder resting on the slatted wood beside him. Oliver was a man who lived strictly in the absolute truth of numbers. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not file false restraining orders or fake severe asthma attacks. I sat down next to him and stared at the heavy folder. I asked what he had found beneath the surface of Bradley's polished life. Oliver opened the flap and extracted a dense stack of printed banking ledgers. The crisp pages were covered in highlighted columns and sharp red ink annotations. He told me the forensic trace was complicated but remarkably revealing. Bradley had gone to extreme lengths to obfuscate the final destination of my annual $50,000 checks. He used a series of dummy routing numbers designed to mimic the billing codes of legitimate pediatric respiratory centers. He layered the transactions through temporary holding accounts to intentionally break the digital chain of custody. But Oliver possessed a relentless intellect. He had breached the sophisticated routing protocol and followed the digital die I had injected into the system with my $20,000 wire transfer. Oliver handed me the first page of the financial summary. I scanned the long lines of sorted data. The $50,000 payments never reached a hospital. The recent $20,000 emergency wire transfer never touched a clinic pharmacy. There was no experimental biologic treatment facility in Colorado. There were no exorbitant pediatric specialist fees. Every single cent I had paid over the past 8 years out of profound guilt and desperate love for my granddaughter had been systematically diverted. The money flowed directly into a corporate holding account, registered under the name Apex Vanguard Holdings. I asked Oliver who owned the corporate entity. He slid a copy of the state business registration across the wooden bench. The executive directors explicitly listed on the legal charter were Bradley and Victoria. They were operating a massive illegal shell company. They used the fabricated narrative of Harper's failing lungs to secure tax-free capital directly from my personal savings. Bradley was turning my profound grief into a continuous, lucrative revenue stream. The magnitude of the betrayal struck me like a physical blow to the sternum. He had forced his 10-year-old daughter to memorize complex medical symptoms and feign life-threatening respiratory attacks. He had locked her in a freezing, uninsulated attic to guarantee my absolute financial compliance. He monetized his own child's daily suffering to fund illicit real estate ventures with his secret mistress. I placed the registration document down on the bench. The anger inside me solidified into something unbreakable. I told Oliver I needed to see the asset ledger for Apex Vanguard Holdings. I needed to know exactly what Bradley was purchasing with the blood money he had extorted from me. Oliver sighed heavily. His expression hardened into a mask of grim sympathy. He flipped to the very last page of the thick folder. He pointed a calloused finger at a highlighted transaction executed only 3 days ago. The shell company had just finalized the purchase of a prime plot of commercial land situated in the industrial district of South Atlanta. The geographic coordinates triggered a violent reaction in my memory. I knew that specific parcel of land intimately. I knew the deep soil composition and the exact layout of the street. That land housed my original structural engineering workshop. I had built my entire career there from the ground up. It was the physical embodiment of my 40 years of hard labor and professional legacy. I stared at the purchase agreement in total disbelief. I had sold that specific property 5 years ago to a local developer after my retirement. Bradley had monitored the real estate market. He waited patiently for the developer to default on the commercial loan. When the property entered foreclosure, Bradley swooped in and purchased it through his anonymous shell company. He used the very money I gave him to secure the deed to my life's work. I asked Oliver what Apex Vanguard Holdings intended to do with the property. Oliver handed me a copy of a municipal zoning permit filed the previous morning. The permit outlined a comprehensive demolition order. Bradley was not simply buying the land as a passive investment. He was preparing to bulldoze my old workshop. He planned to pave over the site and erect a luxury commercial complex. Bradley intended to physically erase the last remaining monument to my legacy. He was using the money I paid to protect my granddaughter to systematically wipe my existence off the map. He wanted to destroy my past while simultaneously stealing my future. The calculated cruelty of his strategy was staggering. He constructed a perfect loop of financial exploitation. But Bradley had made a fatal miscalculation. He believed I was a broken man incapable of defending himself. He believed the restraining order would paralyze me with fear. He did not understand that an engineer knows exactly how to bring down a building. You do not attack the exterior walls. You strike the hidden load-bearing columns. Bradley unknowingly handed me the exact coordinates of his most vulnerable pillar. I closed the manila folder and tucked it securely under my arm. I thanked Oliver for his work. I walked back to my truck with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. I now held the undeniable proof required to activate Evelyn's final failsafe. I drove back from the secluded park with the heavy manila folder resting on the passenger seat of my truck. The sun had already dipped below the horizon and the streetlights cast long, rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. Bradley had purchased the land beneath my old engineering workshop. He planned to demolish my legacy using the exact funds I provided to keep my granddaughter breathing. The sheer audacity of his maneuver was staggering. He had constructed a perfect loop of financial exploitation. He believed his shell company provided absolute anonymity. He believed his legal barricade was entirely impenetrable. He was wrong. The time for gathering intelligence was over. The time for structural testing had passed. I needed to trigger the demolition. I parked in my driveway and walked up the front steps. I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet house. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt expectant. I walked directly past the kitchen and headed down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I entered the room I had shared with Evelyn for 35 years. Her presence still lingered in the faint scent of lavender and old paper. I walked to the far corner of the room and pushed aside a heavy woven rug. Beneath the rug lay a solid oak floorboard. I knelt on the cold wood and pressed my fingers against a hidden latch. The board popped up, revealing a heavy steel floor safe embedded directly into the foundation of the house. The safe belonged entirely to Evelyn. I spun the cold metal dial, 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The heavy steel bolts clicked back with a solid, satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy door open. A rush of stale air greeted me. Inside the dark cavity sat a single thick leather binder. I lifted it out carefully. The leather was worn at the edges. It felt heavy in my hands. I carried the binder to the reading chair by the window and turned on the brass reading lamp. Evelyn was not a woman who relied on blind faith. She was a senior forensic auditor for a major accounting firm. While I spent my life calculating the physical stress limits of concrete and steel, Evelyn spent her life tracking the invisible flow of hidden money. She could look at a ledger and spot a fabricated number with terrifying speed. She understood human greed better than anyone I had ever known. When Aaliyah first brought Bradley home, I saw a polite, ambitious young man. Evelyn saw a predator. She never trusted his slick demeanor. She noted the expensive watches he wore and the vague explanations he provided about his hedge fund. She told me his charm was a facade. She told me he was a man who took without giving back. When Aaliyah died in the car crash, my grief blinded me completely. I was consumed by the guilt of surviving the wreck while my daughter perished. I simply wanted to ensure Harper was protected at all costs. But Evelyn did not let her profound grief paralyze her sharp intellect. When the doctors told her she only had 6 months left to live, she did not panic. She went to work. I opened the leather binder and turned to the first page. The document was heavily notarized and stamped with the official seal of a highly exclusive private wealth management firm. It was a classified legal instrument known as a dead man's trust. Evelyn established this trust entirely in secret during her final months. She knew my guilt over the car crash would compel me to financially support Bradley. She knew I would write whatever checks he demanded to keep Harper close to me. She also knew Bradley's insatiable greed would eventually compel him to misuse those funds. Evelyn engineered the $50,000 annual payment not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a highly sophisticated legal trap. She legally bound those specific funds to Harper's absolute medical welfare. The trust contained a razor-sharp stipulation. It stated that if Bradley ever committed verifiable financial fraud using those specific trace funds, all assets purchased with that money would automatically and irrevocably revert to Harper's name. The money I had been handing him was laced with a legal poison. I read through the complex legal jargon with deep admiration. Evelyn had constructed a flawless mechanism. She turned Bradley's own voracious greed into the exact instrument of his ultimate destruction. If he used the medical money to buy commercial real estate, that real estate legally belonged to my granddaughter. But there was a massive structural obstacle standing in my way. The trust required absolute concrete proof of fraudulent diversion to trigger the asset reversion clause. I could not simply walk into a courtroom with Oliver's forensic trace report. Bradley was heavily insulated by a labyrinth of corporate shell companies. He had Victoria acting as the executive director on paper to distance himself from the transactions. He had a legion of high-priced corporate attorneys ready to tie up any accusation in years of litigation. Bradley held impenetrable legal shielding. The paper trail Oliver uncovered was brilliant, but it remained circumstantial without a direct confession or a fatal administrative error. I needed to connect Bradley directly to the fraudulent purchase of my engineering workshop. I needed to pierce his corporate veil and expose the rotting core of his operation to the federal authorities. Evelyn understood that financial fraud is extremely difficult to prosecute when the victim willingly hands over the money. She knew the police would view my annual payments as a civil matter, a family dispute over child care expenses. Therefore, she bypassed the criminal justice system entirely. The dead man's trust was a self-executing contract. It did not require a criminal conviction to activate. It only required irrefutable proof of a breach of fiduciary duty. Bradley was legally designated as the custodian of Harper's medical funds. By funneling those funds into a commercial real estate venture, he breached that duty. But the legal shielding of Apex Vanguard Holdings prevented the trust from recognizing Bradley as the true purchaser. Victoria's signature was on the documents. The shell company's name was on the deed. I had to force Bradley to publicly sever that protective layer. I had to force him to claim the physical property as his own. I closed the leather binder and let my hands rest on the smooth cover. Evelyn had built the bomb. She had laid the wiring perfectly beneath the floorboards of Bradley's life. Now it was up to me to supply the spark. I thought about Harper freezing in that uninsulated attic, scrubbing the floorboards in absolute terror. I thought about Victoria wearing Aaliyah's sacred jade bracelet on her wrist. I thought about Bradley standing in my kitchen demanding $20,000 with a cold, dictatorial threat. He believed he was the grand architect of my misery. He had no idea he was dancing on a minefield designed by a forensic auditor and currently operated by a structural engineer. To trigger the clause in the dead man's trust, I needed to bait Bradley into making a public, undeniable claim over the stolen assets. I needed him to step out from behind the shadow of Apex Vanguard Holdings. I needed him to look me in the eye and proudly admit his ownership of the land he bought with stolen medical funds. My engineering background taught me that the best way to destroy a reinforced structure is to use its own massive weight against it. Bradley's ego was his most massive, unsupportable weight. His desire to crush me, to humiliate me, and to erase my legacy would be the exact force that brought his empire down. He could not resist the opportunity to stand on my land and claim victory. I finished my glass of water and walked back to the master bedroom. I placed the leather binder back inside the heavy steel floor safe. I locked the dial and slid the solid oak floorboard back into place. I rolled the heavy woven rug over the hidden compartment, concealing the weapon that would soon end this war. I finally lay down to sleep. For the first time since my daughter died 8 years ago, my heart was perfectly calm. The silent adjustment was shifting into its final, irrevocable phase. I stood inside the cavernous space of my engineering workshop. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light filtering through the windows. The distinct smell of drafting paper and machine oil filled the air. This building was the physical anchor of my professional life. I ran my calloused hand over the scarred surface of my primary drafting table. I had personally designed the structural supports for half the commercial buildings in downtown Atlanta on this piece of oak. The silence of the room was absolute. It was the atmosphere before a demolition. I knew the peace was temporary. The trap was set. The bait was laid. I simply had to wait for the predator to arrive. The deep rumble of heavy diesel engines shattered the morning quiet. The wooden floorboards vibrated beneath my heavy work boots. A dark shadow fell across the frosted glass of the main sliding door. The metallic screech of the tracks announced the imminent arrival of the demolition crew. The final phase of my silent adjustment was in motion. Bradley strode into the workshop with the aggressive entitlement of a conquering general. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that contrasted sharply with the grease-stained concrete floor beneath his expensive shoes. He was not alone. 2 burly men in bright vests and hard hats flanked him. They carried metal clipboards and industrial measuring tape. Behind them walked Victoria. She wore designer sunglasses and held a steaming cup of coffee. The jade bracelet rested heavy and green against her pale wrist, a reminder of her complicity. But the sight that tested my legendary composure was the fragile figure trailing behind them. Bradley had brought Harper. He gripped her by the shoulders, steering her into the dusty workshop. She wore the same gray sweater I had witnessed her wearing in the freezing attic. Her dark eyes were wide with sheer terror. Bradley had brought her here for a purpose. He wanted to demonstrate his dominance over her world. He wanted Harper to witness the destruction of her only remaining protector. He wanted to extinguish the last spark of hope in his own daughter's eyes. Bradley stopped a few feet from my drafting table. He looked around the cavernous space with a theatrical grimace of disgust. He waved his hand dismissively at the racks of rolled blueprints and the steel calipers lining the brick walls. He pulled a white legal document from his breast pocket and tossed it casually onto the center of my oak table. The paper slid across the smooth wood and stopped mere inches from my resting hand. It was a formal court-sanctioned eviction notice. It carried the official embossed seal of the municipal court and the sleek corporate letterhead of Apex Vanguard Holdings. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate these premises," Tyrone Bradley announced. His voice echoed off the high corrugated steel ceiling. "The demolition crew is scheduled to begin the teardown immediately. The bulldozers are already idling outside the fence. We are clearing all of this junk out today." Victoria stepped forward and linked her arm through his. She looked at my drafting tools with boredom. I cannot believe you kept this miserable shack standing for so long, she sneered. It smells like rust, decay, and failure. Bradley laughed a harsh laugh. He turned his attention back to me, anticipating a violent outburst. His eyes were wide with vicious triumph. Look around you, old man, he mocked. Look at your pathetic legacy. You spent 40 years drawing lines on paper. I spent the last 8 years taking everything you own. You thought you were protecting your granddaughter with your monthly charity checks. You were foolish. I took every single dime. The money you bled for paid for my new commercial empire. Old money is perfectly designed to build new empires, Tyrone. Your $50,000 a year paved the very parking lot outside. That desperate wire transfer yesterday covered the final closing costs for this exact piece of dirt. You practically bought the bulldozers that are going to crush your history into gravel. He pointed a rigid finger at the floorboards. You do not own a single inch of this property anymore. I own it. Apex Vanguard Holdings owns it. I control the land. I control the assets, and I control Harper. You have absolutely nothing left to fight with. Get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not offer a single word of protest, defense, or retaliation. Decades of calculating catastrophic structural failures taught me a vital lesson. Arguing with a collapsing wall is a massive waste of human energy. You simply step back and let gravity execute the inevitable work. I picked up the eviction notice, folded it precisely in half, and placed it securely in my shirt pocket. I turned my back on Bradley entirely. I reached for my worn leather satchel resting on the adjacent drafting stool. I began to methodically pack my precision drafting tools. I placed my heavy brass compasses, my stainless steel rulers, and my graphite pencils into their designated compartments. My physical movements were incredibly slow, deliberate, and completely untroubled by his aggressive, loud posturing. My absolute, unwavering silence visibly infuriated him. He desperately wanted me to scream. He wanted a physical reaction to validate his victory. Harper stood frozen near the massive sliding door. I let my eyes meet hers for a brief, agonizing second. Her facial expression shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. Absolute, crushing despair radiated from her small, pale face. She watched me silently packing my bags, and she genuinely believed I was surrendering. She believed her cruel father had truly won the war. I zipped the leather satchel closed with a loud, definitive pull. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my heavy canvas work jacket. My thumb brushed against the thick, dark button sewn into the left lapel. I pressed the solid plastic center with a firm, deliberate push. A tiny, imperceptible vibration against my collarbone confirmed the activation. The hidden digital recording device was fully operational. I had successfully captured the entire interaction in high-definition audio. I had Bradley explicitly boasting about using the specific medical funds to build his new empire. I had him proudly claiming ownership of the shell company and the illegally purchased land. I possessed the undeniable recorded confession required to trigger the irrevocable fraud clause of the dead man's trust. He had unwittingly handed me the detonator to his own rapid destruction. I slung the heavy leather satchel over my right shoulder. I walked directly past Bradley without acknowledging his physical presence in the room. I walked past Victoria and her stolen jade bracelet. I paused briefly beside Harper, wishing desperately I could offer her a single comforting word. But the silence had to remain absolute to preserve the trap. I walked out into the morning sunlight, leaving my workshop behind. I stepped off the property as a defeated man. I climbed into my truck and drove away carrying the weapon that would obliterate Bradley's entire world by the end of the day. I drove away, leaving the roar of bulldozers behind. The heavy leather satchel rested securely on the passenger seat, containing the culmination of Evelyn's brilliant foresight and my calculated silence. I navigated the heavy midday traffic of the city with absolute precision. My destination was the First National Central Bank. Bradley housed the primary accounts for Apex Vanguard Holdings here. I parked my truck in the subterranean garage surrounded by rows of pristine luxury sedans. I took the elevator directly to the 40th floor. The air smelled of expensive cologne and polished mahogany. A young receptionist in a tailored suit asked for my appointment. I bypassed her desk completely and walked straight toward the heavy double doors at the corridor's end. The gold plaque read Regional Director. I pushed the heavy doors open without knocking. Arthur Penhaligon sat behind a massive, polished mahogany desk. He looked up with a sharp glare of immense irritation. He demanded to know how I bypassed his security and ordered me to leave before calling the guards. I did not retreat or hesitate. I placed my worn leather satchel directly onto the center of his immaculate desk. I unbuckled the straps. I told him my name. I watched the flicker of recognition cross his eyes. Bradley had undoubtedly labeled me as the senile cash cow grandfather during their private lunches. Arthur attempted a condescending smile, telling me customer service for personal checking accounts was on the ground floor before reaching for his telephone to summon security. I slammed my heavy, calloused hand flat against the polished wood. The sharp sound cracked through the office. I told him I was not here to balance a checking account, but to execute a catastrophic asset seizure. I pulled the thick leather binder from my satchel and dropped it onto the desk. The heavy thump made Arthur flinch. I opened the binder to the heavily notarized pages of the dead man's trust. I informed Arthur he was currently housing an illegal shell company built entirely on extorted medical funds. Arthur scoffed loudly. He leaned back in his high leather chair and crossed his arms. He stated that Apex Vanguard Holdings was a perfectly legitimate corporate entity. He claimed the bank required a direct court order to acknowledge a dispute over commercial funds. He deployed the bureaucratic shielding Bradley relied upon. I did not argue. I extracted Oliver Vance's forensic trace report and spread the highlighted ledgers across the desk, completely covering Arthur's keyboard. I traced the flow of my annual payments with my index finger. I showed him the dummy routing numbers, the temporary holding accounts, and the final deposit into Apex Vanguard. I showed him the exact digital die from my emergency wire transfer landing squarely in the shell company's primary purchasing account. Arthur's condescending smile faltered as he stared at the red ink and the undeniable chain of custody. He swallowed hard, but his corporate loyalty held firm. He argued that a forensic trace was merely circumstantial without a criminal conviction. He stated that Bradley was a highly respected developer and these transfers could be misconstrued as legitimate family loans. He reached for his black telephone again. He told me the meeting was over. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small digital recording device. I placed it gently on top of the financial ledgers. I pressed the playback button. Bradley's arrogant, mocking voice instantly filled the quiet executive office. The audio was pristine. Bradley boasted explicitly about taking the medical funds. He proudly admitted that my desperate wire transfer covered the closing costs for the industrial land. He loudly declared his absolute control over Apex Vanguard Holdings. The recording stripped away every layer of legal insulation in seconds. It was a direct, undeniable confession of financial fraud and extortion. I turned the pages of the leather binder to the final binding clause of the dead man's trust. I tapped the embossed legal seal. I read the final stipulation aloud. Any verifiable fraud committed using the designated medical funds irrevocably triggers an immediate reversion of all purchased assets back to the original beneficiary. I looked Arthur directly in the eyes. I told him the assets currently held by Apex Vanguard Holdings no longer belonged to Bradley. They legally belonged to Harper. By housing those stolen funds and facilitating fraudulent real estate transactions, the bank was now an active accomplice in a massive federal crime. The color drained completely from Arthur's face. He stared at the recording device and the legal trust. The impenetrable wall he had built around Bradley had just collapsed into dust. Arthur immediately calculated his own liability. He recognized the catastrophic danger I presented to his career. Arthur carefully masked his panic with a thin veneer of compliance, telling me he understood the severity of the situation. He promised to launch a full internal review of the accounts immediately. He stated he needed to contact the legal department to authorize the freeze and picked up his desk phone. But I clearly saw the slight traitorous shift in his eyes. I saw his thumb hover over a specific speed dial button. Arthur was not calling his legal department. He was calling Bradley. He was attempting to give his wealthy client a 10-minute head start to drain the accounts before the freeze took effect, choosing to protect the predator. I moved faster than he thought a 70-year-old man could move. I reached across the desk and slammed my hand down on the telephone receiver, cutting the line instantly. I pulled a secondary legal document from my satchel. It was a fully drafted, heavily documented report addressed directly to the Federal Trade Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The report detailed the bank's willful complicity in laundering extorted funds, including Arthur's name as the primary facilitating officer. I slid the document across the mahogany desk. I told him he had exactly 3 seconds to make a permanent career decision. He could execute the fraud clause and freeze every asset tied to Apex Vanguard Holdings immediately, or I would walk out and electronically file the federal report. I promised him he would face a federal indictment for money laundering before his lunch break. I stood still and started counting aloud. 1. Arthur stared terrified at the federal report. 2. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead. His hands trembled violently. 3. He dropped the heavy telephone receiver. He lunged toward his computer keyboard. He frantically typed his executive override credentials into the banking system. The mechanical clacking of the keys was the only sound in the room. He accessed the master ledger for Apex Vanguard Holdings and navigated to the primary commercial accounts. With a final, terrified strike of the enter key, he executed a total institutional freeze. The screen flashed bright red, confirming the lock. Every cent Bradley had stolen, every property purchased, and every liquid asset he possessed was now completely frozen and legally bound to the dead man's trust. The financial guillotine had dropped. I gathered my documents, placed them back into the leather satchel, and walked out of the office without a backward glance. Bradley's empire was dead. I walked out of the First National Central Bank and stepped into the blinding afternoon sun. The chaotic noise of the downtown traffic washed over me, but my mind was completely silent. I had just severed the financial artery of Bradley's empire. The total asset freeze would suffocate his shell company within hours. He was currently bleeding out on a corporate level, completely unable to access the funds he had stolen from me, unable to pay his contractors, and unable to hide his illicit wealth. I climbed into my truck and gripped the steering wheel. I expected to feel a profound sense of closure. I had executed Evelyn's final directive. I had reclaimed Harper's stolen inheritance. Yet a heavy, cold knot remained tightly coiled in the pit of my stomach. The structural integrity of Bradley's deception felt too vast, too deeply rooted to be dismantled by a single financial stroke. I started the engine and drove toward the industrial district. Oliver Vance had requested an immediate, in-person meeting. He had sent a highly encrypted text message containing only an address and a demand for absolute urgency. I arrived at a nondescript windowless brick building situated near the rail yards. It was a secure data facility where Oliver maintained his private servers. I bypassed the keypad entry using the code he provided and walked down a narrow concrete corridor. I pushed open the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. Oliver sat in the center of a dimly lit room surrounded by banks of humming computer towers and glowing monitors. He did not look up when I entered. He did not offer a greeting. His face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens, and his expression was a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. I had never seen the forensic accountant look shaken. He was a man who dissected corporate fraud and offshore embezzlement with surgical detachment. Today, his hands were trembling over his keyboard. I walked slowly toward his desk. I asked him what he had found in the wreckage of Apex Vanguard Holdings. Oliver took a slow, deep breath. He explained that when Arthur Penhaligon executed the federal freeze on the bank accounts, the sudden administrative lockout triggered an automated backup protocol within Bradley's private servers. The shell company's system attempted to dump its encrypted ledgers into an offshore server to protect the data. Oliver had anticipated this exact digital reflex. He had positioned a tracking script within the network architecture. When Bradley's system opened the emergency backdoor, Oliver breached the primary firewall. He bypassed the encryption keys and downloaded the entire unredacted history of Apex Vanguard Holdings. He wanted to ensure Bradley had not hidden any secondary liquid assets. Instead, Oliver found a deeply buried password-protected archive file dating back precisely 8 years. It was filed under a completely different corporate alias, a precursor to his current shell company. Oliver swiveled his monitor so I could see the screen. He opened a digitized legal document. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy. The named insured was my daughter, Aaliyah. The primary beneficiary was Bradley. I stared at the bold black text on the glowing screen. The policy was valued at $2 million. My eyes locked onto the execution date stamped at the bottom of the digital page. Bradley had taken out this massive, high-premium policy exactly 1 month before the fatal car crash. A cold, paralyzing numbness began to spread through my limbs. Aaliyah was a healthy, vibrant young woman. She had no pre-existing medical conditions. She did not work in a dangerous profession. There was absolutely no logical reason for a husband to secretly purchase a $2 million life insurance policy on a healthy wife just weeks before she violently died on a rain-slicked highway. I demanded Oliver explain the rest of the archive. He pulled up a highly classified payroll ledger. The ledger detailed a series of automated, untraceable monthly stipends dispersed from the original shell company. These payments began exactly 2 weeks after Aaliyah's death. They continued uninterrupted every single month for the past 8 years. The money was routed through a complex web of anonymous prepaid debit accounts. Oliver had spent the last 4 hours systematically cracking the routing layers to identify the final recipient. He tapped a key and a criminal background file appeared on the screen next to the payroll ledger. The photograph showed a heavy-set man with a scarred face. I recognized the man instantly. His name was Marcus Thorne. He was the commercial truck driver who had crossed the median and struck Aaliyah's car. The official police report had classified the collision as a tragic, unavoidable accident. Thorne claimed his brakes had failed on the wet asphalt. He served a minimal sentence for vehicular manslaughter and lost his commercial license. I had spent 8 years agonizing over the random cruelty of the universe. I had carried the suffocating guilt of surviving the crash while my daughter was crushed. I had handed Bradley $50,000 a year out of profound remorse, believing he was a grieving widower struggling to raise my sick granddaughter. The truth was a perfectly engineered nightmare. Bradley had orchestrated the entire collision. He had hired Marcus Thorne to execute a targeted vehicular homicide. He murdered his own wife to collect a $2 million payout. He then used the life insurance money to seed his commercial real estate empire. When the insurance capital eventually ran dry, he fabricated Harper's respiratory illness to extort my savings. He had turned my daughter's blood into his foundational capital. A sudden blinding spike of agony ripped through the center of my chest. The pain was absolute and entirely physical. It felt as though a jagged steel beam had snapped and driven itself directly through my sternum. I gasped for air, but my lungs refused to expand. My vision blurred at the edges, darkening into a narrow tunnel. I stumbled backward, my heavy work boots catching on thick cables. I hit the sharp edge of a metal server rack and collapsed on my right knee. My left arm went completely numb. The deep, heavy ache radiated upward, gripping my jaw like a vice. Oliver bolted out of his desk chair. He shouted my name in panic. He reached for his mobile phone, his thumb frantically hovering over the emergency dial pad. He yelled that I was experiencing a massive cardiac event. He told me he was calling the paramedics immediately. I raised my right hand. My fingers hooked into the thick fabric of Oliver's shirt, pulling him down to my level. I gripped him with a terrifying, desperate strength. My breathing was shallow and ragged. Every inhalation felt like swallowing broken glass. I commanded him to put the phone down. Oliver stared at me in sheer disbelief. He argued that my heart was actively failing. He told me I would die on the concrete floor if I did not receive immediate medical intervention. I stared directly into his panicked eyes. I completely ignored the crushing weight in my chest. I forced myself to stand up. I must finish the war today. I left Oliver standing in the cold data center. The crushing weight in my chest remained a dull ache, but the adrenaline surging through my veins overrode the physical pain entirely. I drove back to my house under the cover of darkness. I knew Bradley's reaction time. The moment he attempted to access any capital from Apex Vanguard Holdings, the banking system would notify him of the total asset freeze. He would realize the legal mechanism of the dead man's trust had been fully triggered. He would understand that every property, every account, and every stolen dollar now legally belonged to Harper. A man like Bradley does not concede defeat when cornered. He resorts to violence. He would come for me to force a reversal. I parked behind the garage and meticulously prepared the battlefield. Decades ago, I designed Category 5 hurricane shelters for commercial clients. I understood exactly how to channel kinetic energy and isolate destructive forces within confined spaces. During my investigation, I applied those exact engineering principles to the central hallway of my home. I reinforced the structural framing of the front vestibule. I installed heavy steel strike plates and solid core doors capable of withstanding massive blunt force trauma. I wired the electronic deadbolts to a central switch located directly in my study. I was not building a fortress to hide within. I was constructing a high-tensile steel cage designed to capture predators. I sat in my leather reading chair in the dark study. I placed my phone on the desk and dialed the local police precinct. I did not hit the send button. I left the device illuminated. The house was completely silent. I controlled my breathing, forcing oxygen into my burning lungs. The wait was brief. The harsh squeal of tires skidding onto my gravel driveway shattered the night. Car doors slammed with violent force. Heavy footsteps marched up the wooden planks of my front porch. Bradley had arrived. He did not come alone. He brought two massive men dressed in dark tactical clothing. They were hired enforcers, corporate thugs paid to extract compliance through physical intimidation. Bradley did not bother knocking. A thunderous crash echoed through the foundation as an enforcer drove his heavy combat boot into my front door. The wood splintered violently. The door flew open, slamming against the interior drywall. Bradley stormed into the foyer. His face was a mask of unhinged, desperate rage. The polished developer was gone. In his place stood a cornered murderer who had just lost his stolen empire. The two enforcers fanned out beside him, their hands resting menacingly on heavy steel batons clipped to their belts. They stepped fully into the confined space of the reinforced vestibule. Tyrone Bradley screamed into the dark house. His voice was shrill and laced with panic. "I know you are in here, old man. Turn on the lights and come out. You have made a catastrophic mistake." I stood up from my leather chair. I walked out of the study and stood at the far end of the long hallway. The dim moonlight spilling through the shattered door illuminated my silhouette. I looked at Bradley with absolute unwavering contempt. I did not speak a single word. My silence infuriated him. He pulled a crumpled legal document from his jacket pocket and waved it in the air. "You triggered Evelyn's trust," Bradley shouted, taking a step deeper into the vestibule. "You froze my accounts. You think you are clever. You think you can steal my company and hand it to a child. You are going to sign this legal release right now. You are going to officially waive the fraud clause and unfreeze my assets, or my men are going to beat you until you cannot hold a pen." He pointed a rigid finger at my face. "You are nothing but a senile, broken old man. You are going to give me back my money." I stared at the man who murdered my daughter for a $2 million payout. I stared at the man who tortured his own child to extort my savings. He believed his hired muscle granted him absolute authority. He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of the space he was standing in. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small electronic remote control. I looked directly into Bradley's panicked eyes. I pressed the single red button in the center of the device. The trap engaged with terrifying precision. The solid core doors concealed within the hallway framing slammed shut simultaneously. The steel deadbolts fired into the reinforced strike plates with a loud, synchronized metallic crack. The front door behind them, heavily weighted and previously held open by a magnetic catch, swung violently shut and locked automatically. Bradley and his two hired enforcers were instantly sealed inside the 6-by-8-foot vestibule. They were trapped in a windowless, reinforced box built to withstand hurricane-force winds. The two enforcers reacted with immediate violence. They unclipped their steel batons and began smashing them against the interior doors. The heavy blows echoed loudly, but the reinforced wood barely vibrated. The structural load was perfectly distributed into the foundation. They threw their massive shoulders against the frame, grunting with exertion. The doors remained entirely immovable. Panic set in. Bradley realized the severity of his tactical error. He pounded his fists against the wood, screaming my name, demanding his release. He threatened to kill me. He threatened to burn the house down. His threats were entirely useless against heavy-gauge steel. I turned my back on the hammering. I walked back into my study. I picked up my mobile phone and finally pressed the send button. I connected directly to the police dispatcher. I reported a violent home invasion in progress. I provided my address and informed them that the intruders were currently trapped inside my front vestibule. The dispatcher assured me that patrol units were already en route. I sat back down in my leather chair and listened to the desperate, muffled screaming coming from the hallway. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated my property 4 minutes later. The wailing sirens cut through the night air, signaling the end of the assault. I walked to the hallway and pressed the release button. The exterior door unlocked. 4 heavily armed officers surged onto the front porch with weapons drawn. They dragged the 2 enforcers out of the vestibule, securing their wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. I stepped forward to witness Bradley's final arrest, but the vestibule was empty. I looked at the side wall. A small decorative stained glass window, intentionally unreinforced to comply with fire codes, was completely shattered. Jagged shards of colored glass littered the floorboards. Crimson blood stained the wooden frame. Hearing the approaching sirens, Bradley realized he was facing decades in federal prison for extortion fraud and the murder of his wife. He abandoned his hired men without a second thought. He smashed his way through the glass, tearing his flesh, and fled into the dark woods. I gave my official statement to the sergeant. The war was not over. The vicious predator was heavily bleeding, cornered, and completely running out of time. Bradley did not simply hide in the dark woods to bleed. He understood his financial empire was completely paralyzed. His shell company was frozen. His hired enforcers were sitting in a police holding cell facing multiple felony charges. The federal authorities were already mobilizing based on Arthur Penhaligon's forced compliance. Bradley had exactly one remaining piece of leverage left in his possession. He had Harper. He calculated that if he could physically remove his daughter from the jurisdiction, he could force me to unfreeze the assets in exchange for her safe return. He needed to reach a country without an active extradition treaty, and he needed absolute legal cover to board an international flight with a minor. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, Bradley's legal team filed an emergency ex parte petition in family court. They requested an immediate suspension of my remaining grandpaternal rights and demanded court authorization for Bradley to relocate Harper overseas for specialized medical treatment. Bradley weaponized his own injuries. He attached photographs of his lacerated face and bandaged hands, officially claiming I was a violent, heavily armed psychopath. He testified under penalty of perjury that I had maliciously lured him to my home, trapped him inside a steel cage, and physically assaulted him in a dementia-fueled rage. He expected the court to rubber stamp the emergency petition. He expected to be at the international terminal by noon. He failed to account for my preparation. I had retained a fiercely intelligent family law attorney weeks ago. My lawyer had heavily monitored the court docket since the moment I executed the financial freeze. We intercepted Bradley's filing the exact second it entered the digital system. My attorney immediately filed a counter-injunction forcing the judge to halt the ex parte order and schedule an emergency evidentiary hearing for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Bradley could not board a plane. He was legally tethered to the courtroom. I arrived at the municipal courthouse 30 minutes early. I wore a dark, immaculately tailored suit. I sat perfectly still at the respondent's table. I did not look at the heavy oak doors. I focused entirely on the empty judge's bench. Bradley entered the courtroom a few minutes later. His physical deterioration was striking. Heavy white bandages covered the entire right side of his jaw and wrapped tightly around his dominant hand. The jagged cuts from my shattered stained glass window had required dozens of stitches. He sat at the petitioner's table and aggressively refused to meet my gaze. Victoria walked in closely behind him. The emergency hearing commenced immediately. Bradley's attorney bypassed opening statements and called Victoria to the witness stand. He intended to establish a narrative of victimhood. Before Victoria became Bradley's partner in commercial fraud, she had spent years aggressively navigating the cutthroat environment of local theater. She completely abandoned her usual display of aggressive luxury. She wore a modest, deeply conservative navy blouse and minimal makeup. She weaponized her tears with absolute precision. She looked directly at the judge and painted a devastatingly false portrait of our family dynamic. Victoria testified that Bradley was a broken, deeply grieving widower who had spent the last 8 years desperately trying to save his daughter's failing lungs. She claimed I was a wealthy, domineering tyrant who used my financial leverage to terrorize them both. She wept openly as she described the events of the previous night. She claimed I had completely lost my grip on reality, that I had fabricated a wild conspiracy theory regarding stolen money, and that I had maliciously frozen the exact bank accounts required to purchase Harper's life-saving medication. She pleaded with the judge to allow Bradley to take Harper to a specialized clinic in Switzerland before my unhinged vendetta literally killed the child. It was a masterclass in calculated perjury. I remained entirely silent at the defense table. I did not shake my head or display a single ounce of indignation. I knew the structural integrity of a lie is entirely dependent on the absence of opposing force. Victoria's testimony was a hollow facade. My lawyer stood up for the cross-examination. He did not ask Victoria a single question regarding her theatrical testimony. He did not waste breath dissecting her fabricated timeline or challenging her crocodile tears. He approached the court clerk and formally submitted a small digital storage drive into the official evidence log. He turned toward the bench and requested permission to display Defendant's Exhibit A. The judge permitted the submission. My attorney directed the bailiff to power on the large, high-definition flat-screen monitors mounted securely across the courtroom walls. Victoria's confident, tearful facade cracked slightly. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. The screens flickered to life. The pitch-black exterior of the Milton estate appeared on the monitors. The visual perspective shifted, tilting sharply upward until the camera lens framed the circular glass of the unfinished attic window. The courtroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The high-definition video I had recorded from the freezing slate roof began to play. The visual contrast was instantly devastating. The monitors displayed Harper huddled on a stained, bare mattress. She wore the ragged gray sweater, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her thin body violently shivering in the frigid air. The dented metal tray and the cold soup rested on the filthy floorboards. The heavy wooden door on the screen suddenly swung open with a violent crash. Victoria marched into the attic wearing her luxurious cashmere robe, holding her steaming mug of gourmet tea. The visual evidence completely shattered her carefully constructed courtroom persona in a matter of seconds. The audio track kicked in with pristine clarity. Victoria's vicious shrieks filled the quiet courtroom. The judge watched Victoria kick the metal tray and demand that Harper scrub the filthy floorboards. The judge watched the terrified 10-year-old girl drop to her bruised knees. Bradley's attorney leaped out of his chair. He shouted objections with aggressive desperation. He demanded the video be stricken from the official record. He argued the footage constituted a massive violation of strict privacy laws. He cited illegal trespass, unauthorized wiretapping statutes, and the absolute expectation of privacy within a private residential domicile. He claimed the video was an illegally obtained, highly prejudicial fabrication. My lawyer stood perfectly still. He countered the objection effortlessly. He cited the state's absolute emergency legal exception for the explicit documentation of active child abuse. He noted that the expectation of privacy is instantly legally voided when an adult utilizes an uninsulated, unheated attic to physically imprison and torture a minor child. The legal precedent was entirely bulletproof. The judge leaned slowly forward over the heavy wooden bench. The cautious skepticism that had previously clouded her facial expression vanished entirely. Her demeanor shifted into an expression of cold, unmitigated, judicial fury. She stared directly at Bradley. She then shifted her piercing gaze toward Victoria, sitting frozen on the witness stand. The judge raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a thunderous crack. She overruled the objection instantly. The custody battle was effectively over. Bradley's final escape route was sealed. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel echoed through the silent courtroom, solidifying the rejection of Bradley's desperate legal defense. The heavy wooden sound signaled the absolute end of Victoria's fabricated narrative. The judge leaned back in her high leather chair, her dark eyes completely devoid of judicial neutrality. She stared down at Bradley and his attorney with a look of unmitigated disgust. She ordered Victoria to step down from the witness stand immediately. Victoria retreated to the petitioner's table, her face pale, the theatrical tears entirely gone. The judge did not ask for closing statements. She turned her attention to the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom. She instructed the bailiff to bring the child into the chamber. The heavy oak doors swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. A female court social worker stepped into the room, gently guiding Harper by the shoulder. Harper wore a simple, clean dress, a stark contrast to the ragged gray sweater from the attic video. Her small face was incredibly pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the municipal building. The absolute silence of the room amplified the soft, hesitant sound of her small shoes crossing the polished hardwood floor. The judge leaned forward, softening her posture and lowering her voice to a gentle, encouraging tone. She asked Harper to step up to the wooden witness box. Harper walked slowly, eyes fixed firmly on the ground. She climbed the small steps. Harper reached out with trembling hands and gripped the wooden railing tightly. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark, polished grain of the wood. She stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment. The court social worker stood directly behind her, offering a silent, reassuring presence. The judge gently asked Harper to state her name for the official court record. Harper took a shallow, ragged breath. She stated her full name in a voice barely above a whisper. The court reporter typed rhythmically, capturing the fragile sound. The judge then asked Harper to tell the court the truth about her medical condition and her living arrangements at the Milton estate. Harper slowly lifted her head. She looked directly at Bradley. Bradley glared back at her with a terrifying, silent intensity, his bandaged face twisted into a mask of pure intimidation, silently commanding her to maintain the 8-year deception. He expected his daughter to cower, to fold under the crushing weight of his psychological control. Harper's lower lip trembled. She broke eye contact with her father. She turned her head and looked across the wide aisle toward the defense table. She looked directly at me. I sat perfectly still. I did not offer a dramatic gesture or a tearful expression. I simply looked back at her with absolute, unwavering solidarity. I projected the silent promise that the steel cage I had built around her father would never open. I smiled. Harper took another deep breath, drawing strength from the unspoken vow. She turned her face back toward the judge. She released her death grip on the wooden railing and let her hands drop to her sides. She began to speak, and her voice steadily gained volume and clarity. She told the court that she did not have severe respiratory failure. She stated clearly that her lungs were perfectly healthy. She explained the meticulous, terrifying routine Bradley had forced upon her since she was 2 years old. She described the heavy, restrictive medical masks he forced her to wear during my scheduled visits. She detailed the exact breathing patterns he made her practice, punishing her if she did not wheeze convincingly. The courtroom remained paralyzed as the 10-year-old girl systematically dismantled the massive extortion scheme. Harper explained how Bradley provided her with detailed handwritten flashcards containing complex medical terminology. He forced her to memorize the names of expensive oxygen therapies and specialized lung capacity treatments. If she stumbled over the pronunciation of the fictional medications during my visits, Victoria would withhold her meals for an entire day. She told the judge how Bradley constantly reminded her that my money was the only thing keeping them alive and that she had to perform perfectly to secure the monthly checks. She articulated the psychological torture of believing her own existence was a burden that required constant deception. Harper detailed her reality. She explained that the pristine, heavily sanitized medical bedroom on the second floor was a complete fabrication, a stage set designed exclusively for my monthly inspections. She testified that the moment my truck pulled out of the long paved driveway, Victoria would immediately strip the expensive linens from the bed. Bradley would grab Harper by the arm and march her up the narrow hidden staircase. They forced her to live in the uninsulated, unfinished attic. She described the freezing temperatures during the winter months, the suffocating heat during the summer, and the thin-stained mattress on the floorboards. She told the court about the metal tray Victoria used to slide cold leftover soup under the heavy wooden door whenever possible. The judge listened to the horrific testimony without interrupting. Her facial muscles tightened with every terrifying detail Harper provided to the court record. Harper explained that she was strictly forbidden from approaching the small circular glass window in the attic unless she was certain my truck was not parked on the street. She lived in absolute terror of ruining the grand illusion. She genuinely believed that if I discovered the truth, Bradley would execute the same violent fate upon her that he had orchestrated for her mother. Harper finished her testimony and stood silently in the wooden box. The massive weight of the 8-year deception lifted entirely from her fragile shoulders. The judge turned her gaze directly toward Bradley. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. She did not deliver a lengthy, verbose judicial lecture. She did not waste time dissecting Bradley's moral failures. She executed the law with swift, devastating precision. She struck the sounding block with a massive, echoing crack. The judge declared Bradley's emergency relocation petition denied with prejudice. She immediately stripped Bradley of all physical and legal parental rights regarding the minor child. She formally granted full, unconditional emergency custody of Harper directly to me. She ordered Child Protective Services to facilitate the immediate physical transfer of the child before we exited the municipal building. The final, irrevocable loss of his most valuable asset shattered Bradley's fragile control. The realization that his stolen empire fell. His stolen empire was frozen and his daughter was permanently gone. This triggered a violent reaction. Bradley let out a guttural scream that echoed off the high courtroom ceiling. He kicked his heavy wooden chair backward, sending it crashing into the gallery railing. He lunged over the defense table, hands outstretched into rigid claws aiming for my throat. He intended to tear me apart in front of the judge. I did not flinch or raise my hands to defend myself. I sat perfectly still, watching the desperate predator launch his final attack. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. The 2 armed bailiffs stationed near the heavy oak doors moved with incredible speed. Court bailiffs tackled Bradley heavily to the ground. Bradley was hauled out of the municipal courthouse in heavy steel handcuffs. His violent outburst earned him an immediate night in the county holding cell. The charge of contempt of court was a minor inconvenience compared to the federal indictments looming on the horizon. By dawn, his highly priced criminal defense attorney secured his release on a massive cash bond. Bradley did not return to his corporate office. He drove directly to his secondary penthouse suite downtown. He understood the legal reality of his situation. The family court had permanently severed his access to Harper. The central bank had frozen his shell company accounts. The Federal Trade Commission was currently dismantling his commercial empire. He had exactly one viable option remaining. He needed to vanish. Bradley opened a concealed wall safe hidden behind a large, abstract painting. He retrieved a secondary passport issued under an alternate alias and a thick stack of vacuum-sealed foreign currency. He pulled out his encrypted mobile phone and dialed a private aviation broker. He booked a direct, untraceable charter flight to a jurisdiction in South America that maintained no active extradition treaty with the United States. He scheduled the departure for midnight. Victoria stood quietly in the shadow of the penthouse corridor. She had followed Bradley from the courthouse, her own survival instincts operating at maximum capacity. She listened to the aviation broker confirm the single-passenger manifest. Bradley was securing a lone seat on the Gulfstream jet. He was taking the untraceable cash and leaving her behind. Victoria processed the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. She was the listed co-signer on half of the fraudulent real estate acquisitions. Her signature authorized the illegal medical supply purchases used to extort my savings. When the federal investigators finally breached the corporate firewall, Bradley would be safely drinking espresso in a foreign villa. Victoria would be left facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The panic in her chest instantly hardened into cold, calculating fury. She waited until Bradley stepped into the master bathroom to shower away the stench of the county jail. The heavy sound of rushing water masked her movements. Victoria slipped into the master study. She bypassed the standard desktop computer and went directly to Bradley's locked briefcase resting on the mahogany desk. She knew his digital architecture. She extracted the heavy matte black master laptop. This encrypted machine contained the raw, unredacted history of his entire operation. Victoria knew exactly what the hard drive contained. It held the digital receipts of the offshore wire transfers. It held the falsified medical records used to imprison Harper. Most importantly, it held the encrypted insurance files and the monthly payroll ledgers connecting Bradley directly to Marcus Thorne. It was the absolute proof of Aaliyah's orchestrated murder. Victoria shoved the heavy laptop into her designer handbag. She grabbed her car keys and slipped out of the penthouse without making a single sound. She navigated her luxury sedan out of the subterranean garage and merged onto the busy interstate. She drove with reckless, frantic speed toward the city limits. Her destination was the Milton estate. She understood that I was the only person possessing enough leverage to offer her a viable exit strategy. I controlled the civil asset recovery suits that would imminently seize her personal bank accounts. She needed absolute immunity, and she possessed the only weapon capable of destroying Bradley completely. The tires of her vehicle screeched loudly as she took the final exit ramp toward my heavily fortified property. She checked her rearview mirror, constantly terrified that Bradley might have noticed her sudden departure. I sat in my reinforced study watching the live feed from my exterior security cameras. I expected Bradley to make another desperate, violent attempt on my property. Instead, Victoria's silver sedan skidded to a halt on my gravel driveway. She stepped out of the vehicle, clutching her heavy handbag to her chest. She looked terrified, constantly scanning the tree line as she rushed up the wooden steps of my front porch. I pressed the release button for the exterior door and stepped into the vestibule. Victoria did not waste time with false pleasantries or theatrical apologies. She reached into her bag and pulled out the matte black laptop. She held it forward like a shield. She told me Bradley was booking a charter flight out of the country tonight. She stated he was abandoning the shell company and leaving her to absorb the federal indictments. She placed the laptop on the small wooden table between us. She told me the hard drive contained the absolute, undeniable proof of Bradley's guilt. It contained the insurance documents and the direct payroll links to the truck driver who killed my daughter. She looked me directly in the eyes. She demanded a binding legal agreement. Victoria explicitly demanded that I drop all civil litigation against her personal assets. She wanted my lawyers to grant her total immunity from the asset reclamation process triggered by the dead man's trust. She offered me the murder weapon in exchange for her financial survival. She explained that without the laptop, Oliver Vance would face months of decryption firewalls before acquiring the concrete evidence needed for a homicide conviction. By then, Bradley would be permanently outside the jurisdiction of American law enforcement. I looked at the terrified woman standing in my hallway. I did not feel an ounce of pity for her impending federal prison sentence. She had actively participated in the systemic torture of my granddaughter. She had locked Harper in a freezing attic and mocked her suffering. However, my primary objective was not Victoria's financial ruin. My objective was Bradley's absolute destruction. I reached out and took the heavy black laptop. I told her I accepted the terms of her surrender. I instructed her to leave my property immediately and never return. She nodded quickly, turning on her heel and sprinting back toward her vehicle. She drove away, leaving the final piece of the puzzle directly in my hands. Back in the downtown penthouse, Bradley stepped out of the steam-filled shower. He wrapped a towel around his waist and walked into the study for his briefcase. He needed to verify the transfer codes before heading to the private airfield. He found the leather flap of the briefcase hanging open. The encrypted master laptop was gone. Panic seized his chest, tightening his lungs with a violent grip. He sprinted into the living room and realized Victoria's belongings were missing. Her car keys were gone. He pulled out his mobile phone and activated the hidden GPS tracking software installed on Victoria's device. The map populated instantly on the glowing screen. A red dot appeared precisely over the address of my estate. Bradley stared at the screen in pure disbelief. Victoria had taken the murder evidence directly to his worst enemy. The ultimate betrayal was complete. He realized his charter flight was no longer a viable escape plan. The authorities would intercept him before he reached the tarmac. He dropped the mobile phone down onto the floor. He retrieved a heavy steel firearm from his desk drawer. He loaded the magazine with terrifying precision. He prepared for his final strike. I carried the matte black laptop into the reinforced study. The heavy steel doors locked behind me. I placed the machine on my desk. Victoria was gone, fleeing into the night, but the weapon she traded for her survival now belonged to me. I powered on the device. The screen glowed white, demanding a complex password. Bradley utilized military-grade encryption protocols, burying his secrets beneath layers of algorithmic concrete. He vastly underestimated the intellectual legacy of my late wife. Evelyn spent her career identifying and dismantling corporate firewalls. She anticipated Bradley's reliance on digital shadows. Before her passing, she compiled a master drive containing a proprietary decryption software suite. She engineered a skeleton key designed to shatter the architecture of offshore shell companies. I retrieved Evelyn's silver flash drive from the hidden compartment in my desk drawer. I held the cold metal, feeling a profound connection to the woman who meticulously mapped the battlefield long before the war officially began. I inserted the drive into the side port of Bradley's laptop. The decryption software launched, automatically bypassing the standard operating system. Black command prompt windows cascaded across the bright screen. Streams of green code flooded the monitors. Evelyn's program systematically attacked Bradley's primary firewall, running thousands of algorithmic permutations per second. I watched the progress bar inch forward. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the cooling fan. The machine resisted the intrusion. Warnings flashed red across the screen, threatening to initiate an automated data wipe. Bradley had rigged his system to self-destruct upon detection of a brute force attack. I remained calm. I typed in the manual override commands Evelyn had written in her physical ledger. I executed a localized mirror protocol, tricking the security parameters into targeting a phantom drive while the primary extraction continued uninterrupted. The red warnings vanished. The green code resumed its relentless assault. I watched the final barrier collapse. A definitive chime sounded. The screen cleared. An unredacted directory appeared. The digital vault was open. Bradley's criminal existence was laid bare in neatly organized folders. I bypassed the fraudulent shell company ledgers I utilized at the bank. I searched for the encrypted archive Oliver uncovered at the data center. I found a deeply buried folder titled with random numbers. I double-clicked the icon. The folder contained a pristine chronological record of premeditated murder. I opened the primary spreadsheet. It documented a series of wire transfers originating from a holding account. The recipient was Marcus Thorne. I stared at the irrefutable chain of custody. The payments began 4 weeks prior to the fatal car crash. I scrolled down the columns, my eyes locking onto the transaction descriptions. Bradley did not attempt to mask the purpose of the funds with ambiguous jargon. Every single wire transfer to the truck driver who killed my daughter was categorized under a specific operational header. The text read, Aaliyah Project. The physical pain in my chest flared with violent intensity. The jagged steel beam in my sternum twisted. Bradley turned my vibrant daughter into a line item on a balance sheet. He calculated the cost of her life, negotiated the price of her execution, and scheduled the payments with the cold detachment of a man paying a utility bill. I pressed my hands flat against the mahogany desk to steady myself. The sheer magnitude of his monstrous cruelty threatened to consume my rational mind. I wanted to tear the house apart. I wanted to shatter the glowing screen. But raw anger is a useless emotion in a tactical war. I needed this evidence pristine and undeniable. I connected a secure external hard drive to the laptop and initiated a total data clone. The extraction process required 10 minutes. I stood over the desk watching the progress bar fill, securing the final nail in Bradley's coffin. The piercing ring of my mobile phone shattered the heavy silence of the study. The caller identification displayed an unknown number. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. Bradley had discovered the theft and tracked his missing hardware. I picked up the device and pressed the green button. I did not offer a greeting. I held the phone to my ear and listened to the ragged, furious breathing of a desperate man. Tyrone Bradley snarled into the receiver. His voice was laced with a terrifying, unhinged manic energy. "You have something that belongs to me." I looked at the glowing laptop screen displaying the Aaliyah Project ledgers. I told him I possessed the absolute proof of his orchestrated vehicular homicide. I informed him that the cloning process was nearly complete, and the federal authorities would receive the unredacted files within the hour. Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. It was the sound of a cornered animal recognizing its own mortality. "You are not sending those files anywhere," Old Man Bradley stated. The background noise was chaotic. I heard the roar of highway traffic and a powerful engine accelerating aggressively. I intercepted Victoria on the interstate. She thought she could betray me and run. She was remarkably stupid. A muffled, terrified whimper echoed through the phone speaker. Victoria was in the vehicle with him. Bradley had tracked her GPS and run her off the road. He captured the traitor. I did not react to Victoria's impending doom. Her survival was not my responsibility. Bradley realized my silence meant I did not care about his hostage. He immediately shifted his leverage to a target he knew would command my absolute compliance. "I am holding a loaded weapon to Victoria's head right now," Bradley whispered with chilling calmness. "If you transmit those files, I will pull the trigger and leave her body in the ditch. But I know you do not care about her. You only care about Harper." The mention of my granddaughter instantly altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. "You have emergency custody," Bradley continued, "but you cannot protect her everywhere. If you involve the federal authorities, if you do not return my laptop, I will not flee the country. I will disappear into the shadows. I will hunt Harper down. I will find her Tyrone. I will take her away from you, and you will never see her again." He was issuing a direct threat against the child's life. The ultimatum was crystal clear. "Listen to me very carefully," Bradley commanded. "You are going to take my laptop. You will bring it to your old engineering workshop on the east side of the city. You have exactly 1 hour to arrive. You will come alone. If I see a single police cruiser, if I detect any federal presence, I execute Victoria and come straight for Harper. Do not test my resolve. You know exactly what I am capable of doing to my own family." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The data clone completed with a soft chime. I safely ejected the external hard drive and placed it into my heavy work jacket. I grabbed the matte black laptop and closed the screen. I locked my study door and walked out into the dark night. The final bloody confrontation was set. I navigated my heavy truck through the dark streets, moving steadily away from the fortified security of my estate. The crushing pain in my chest remained a constant, suffocating companion, a physical reminder of the sheer adrenaline and stress coursing through my aging veins. Every breath required an agonizing effort, but my mind was operating with absolute clarity. I made the deliberate tactical decision not to contact the local police or federal authorities regarding Bradley's current location. Bradley had explicitly threatened to execute Victoria and hunt down Harper if he detected a single police cruiser approaching the drop site. He was a cornered, heavily armed murderer with nothing left to lose. Involving a SWAT team in an uncontrolled environment would instantly trigger a bloodbath. I needed to isolate the predator on a battlefield that I completely controlled. I drove toward the industrial east side of the city, heading directly to the abandoned engineering workshop where Bradley had arrogantly handed me an eviction notice just days prior. He believed the workshop represented my total defeat. He failed to realize it was my ultimate domain. The worn leather satchel sat on the passenger seat beside me, containing the encrypted master laptop and a rolled set of faded drafting blueprints. I had designed and constructed the structural framework of the East Side workshop over 40 years ago. I knew every weld, every joint, and every steel pillar in the entire building. I navigated the crumbling asphalt of the industrial access road. The workshop stood silent and imposing in the darkness, a massive corrugated steel and brick structure casting long shadows across the gravel lot. I parked my truck out of sight behind the rear loading dock. I gathered my tools, the heavy laptop, and the blueprints, stepping out into the cold night air. I unlocked the reinforced side door using my master key and stepped inside the cavernous space. The familiar scent of machine oil, rusted metal, and old drafting paper filled my lungs. The building was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint light of street lamps filtering through the frosted upper windows. I walked directly to the front of the workshop. The main entryway featured a massive industrial sliding steel door. The door was 12 feet high and 10 feet wide, constructed of solid, heavy gauge steel plating. It weighed easily over 1,000 pounds. The door operated on a suspended overhead track system rolling horizontally on heavy steel casters. It was designed to secure heavy machinery and block out severe weather. I clicked on a small tactical flashlight and spread my old drafting blueprints across a nearby workbench. I traced my finger along the schematic lines detailing the overhead track assembly. I did not intend to barricade the door. I intended to weaponize it. I pinpointed the primary steel support brackets that secured the heavy steel track to the reinforced brick header. If those specific brackets failed, the entire track system would instantly detach from the ceiling. 1,000 pounds of steel would drop vertically with catastrophic force. I retrieved a heavy steel wrench, industrial bolt cutters, and a sledgehammer from the storage locker. I climbed a tall aluminum stepladder, positioning myself directly beneath the overhead track mechanism. Ignoring the sharp radiating pain shooting through my chest, I went to work. I systematically unbolted the secondary safety catches and the primary stabilization brackets holding the steel track in place. The massive door groaned and shifted slightly, its entire weight now resting precariously on two final central steel pins. I used the sledgehammer to violently strike the support housing, bending the metal just enough to loosen the tension on the final pins. I tied a thick braided steel wire directly to the retaining clips of those two critical pins. I ran the wire along the ceiling truss, dropping the end down behind the thick brick pillar where I intended to stand. I created a manual deadfall release. A forceful pull on the wire would yank the retaining pins out of the housing, dropping the massive steel door instantly. With the trap perfectly engineered and primed, I climbed down from the ladder and wiped the grease from my calloused hands. I needed to ensure Bradley stepped exactly into the precise drop zone beneath the suspended steel door. I grabbed a heavy wooden shipping crate and dragged it directly into the center of the entryway, positioning it exactly underneath the loosened track system. I opened my leather satchel and extracted the heavy, matte black laptop containing the irrefutable evidence of Aaliyah's murder. I placed the laptop squarely in the center of the wooden crate. The bait was perfectly laid. The kill box was established. I retreated to the heavy brick pillar situated 10 feet away, wrapping the end of the steel release wire tightly around my right hand. I turned off my tactical flashlight, plunging the cavernous workshop back into total darkness. I stood perfectly still, controlling my shallow breathing, and waited for the monster to arrive. 10 minutes later, the violent roar of a powerful engine shattered the quiet industrial district. A dark luxury SUV turned onto the gravel lot at breakneck speed. The vehicle skidded wildly, kicking up a massive cloud of dust before slamming into park directly in front of the workshop main entrance. The headlights pierced the darkness, casting blinding beams of harsh white light through the frosted windows. The driver's side door flew open. Bradley stepped out into the night. His tailored suit was torn and covered in dirt. The heavy white bandages on his face were stained with fresh blood from his frantic escape through my stained glass window. He radiated a toxic, terrifying aura of absolute desperation. He walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle and ripped the door open. Victoria shrieked in terror as Bradley grabbed a fistful of her hair and violently dragged her out. She stumbled onto the gravel, crying and begging for mercy. Bradley did not listen. He kept a brutal grip on her hair, forcing her to walk ahead of him toward the workshop. He held a heavy-caliber handgun in his dominant right hand, the barrel pressed directly against the back of Victoria's skull. He kicked the side door open and shoved her into the dark, cavernous space. Victoria collapsed onto the concrete floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Bradley stepped inside his chest, heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the dark room. He spotted my silhouette standing behind the heavy brick pillar. He raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at the center of my chest. He screamed my name, his voice echoing violently off the corrugated steel roof. He demanded I hand over the laptop immediately. He swore he would execute Victoria and empty the rest of the magazine into me if I hesitated for a single second. I maintained an absolute terrifying silence. I slowly raised my left hand and pointed a single finger toward the center of the room. Bradley saw the laptop sitting perfectly on the wooden crate. He shoved his weapon against Victoria's head, forcing her to walk forward. Bradley stepped directly beneath the altered steel door. The predator had willingly walked into the cage. Bradley stood positioned within the designated kill box. The heavy steel door hung above him, held by the bent tension of two compromised pins. He remained focused on the matte black laptop resting on the wooden crate. His chest heaved with rapid adrenaline-fueled breaths. The heavy caliber handgun in his hand trembled from the unadulterated exhaustion of a cornered predator. He pushed Victoria forward with the weapon. She fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Bradley ignored her entirely. He locked his bloodshot eyes onto my face. He demanded I step away from the crate. He commanded me to place my hands against the brick pillar. He projected absolute authority, desperately clinging to the illusion that he still controlled the narrative. He told me that once he secured the hard drive, he would leave Victoria and disappear. He promised that if I remained compliant, he would not hunt Harper. He lied with the practiced ease of a sociopath. I knew he intended to execute Victoria the moment he had the laptop securely in his grip. I knew he would then turn the weapon on me. He could not leave witnesses alive. I did not move. I kept my right hand firmly wrapped around the braided steel wire hidden behind the pillar. I stared back at him with absolute calm. I told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the reality of his situation. Bradley sneered, taking another confident step forward. He moved directly under the center mass of the suspended steel door. He reached out with his left hand, his fingers extending toward the matte black casing of the laptop. He believed he was seconds away from reclaiming his stolen empire. He believed he had won. I broke my long silence. I spoke with a quiet clarity. My voice cut through the cavernous echo of the workshop. I informed Bradley that the laptop on the wooden crate was completely useless to him now. I watched his hand freeze mere inches from the device. I explained the mechanics of the digital extraction I had performed. I detailed the proprietary decryption software Evelyn had engineered decades ago. I told him his military firewalls were dismantled in less than 10 minutes. The color drained from his face as the implication registered in his panicked mind. I did not stop there. I needed to shatter his entire psychological foundation completely today. I informed him that I had already cloned the unredacted directory. I told him I secured the direct payroll ledgers, the offshore transfers, and the operational folders explicitly labeled as the Aaliyah project. Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. I delivered the final blow. I revealed that a secure encrypted transmission had automatically triggered the moment I completed the cloning process. I stated clearly that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the district attorney already possessed remote copies of his entire hard drive. The evidence was actively being processed by federal cybercrimes divisions. The laptop was an empty shell. It was a piece of bait designed exclusively to lure him to this exact location. Bradley stared at me in paralyzing horror. The carefully constructed facade of the corporate titan crumbled into dust. He realized the charter flight was a phantom. He realized his untraceable cash was useless. The federal indictments were no longer a looming threat. They were an immediate, inescapable reality. The undeniable proof of his extortion, fraud, and orchestrated vehicular homicide was securely in the hands of the authorities. He had no leverage left. The heavy caliber handgun slipped from his trembling fingers. The weapon fell down. It hit the solid concrete floor with a metallic clatter, sliding harmlessly away into the shadows. Bradley's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the ground directly beside the wooden crate. The fight completely drained out of his body. He stared blankly at the dark grease-stained floorboards. Victoria huddled a few feet away, watching his total breakdown with wide, terrified eyes. Bradley raised his head. His arrogant, commanding demeanor vanished, entirely replaced by the pathetic, sniveling desperation of a broken coward. He began to beg. He pleaded for his life. He asked me to contact the authorities and recant my statements. He offered to sign over every remaining asset he possessed. He promised to vanish completely and never contact Harper again. When I remained silent, he committed the ultimate unforgivable insult. He invoked the name of my murdered daughter. Bradley looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He begged me to show him mercy in Aaliyah's name. He claimed that Aaliyah would not want him to spend the rest of his life rotting in a maximum security penitentiary. He weaponized the memory of the woman he had meticulously ordered killed. Raw white-hot fury ignited in my chest. He had calculated the cost of Aaliyah's life, paid Marcus Thorne to run her off the highway, and now he dared to use her name to shield himself from the consequences. I tightened my grip on the braided steel wire. I did not yell. I did not curse him. I executed the final sequence of my trap with absolute clinical precision. I braced my boots against the solid base of the brick pillar. I pulled the steel cord backward with every ounce of physical strength I possessed in my aging body. The sharp sound of snapping metal echoed loudly everywhere. The manual deadfall release functioned flawlessly. The braided wire yanked the two critical retaining pins out of their steel housing. The 1,000-pound industrial door detached from the weakened overhead track. It dropped vertically with catastrophic speed. The gravitational force of the solid steel plate displacing the air created a rushing vacuum. Bradley screamed and threw himself backwards, scrambling across the concrete. The heavy door slammed into the ground with an earth-shattering crash. Dust and debris exploded outward in a choking cloud. The concrete foundation shook violently beneath my boots. The deafening impact echoed endlessly. The silence that followed was profound. I stepped out from behind the pillar. The dust settled in the dim light of the street lamps. I looked down at the drop zone. I had not engineered the deadfall to execute Bradley. Death was a swift release he fundamentally did not deserve. I engineered the trap to establish absolute dominance. The massive door had dropped perfectly. The heavy metal base crashed into the floor exactly 1 inch from Bradley's outstretched right hand. The door pinned the thick material of his heavy wool coat completely to the ground. He was trapped. He lay flat on his back, hyperventilating. He stared up at the wall of solid steel that had missed crushing his skull by a microscopic margin. He pulled frantically at his arm, but the coat was immovably anchored beneath dead weight. He was tethered to the floor like a captured animal. I walked slowly across the concrete, my boots crunching softly on the debris. I stood directly over him. He looked up at me with absolute terror. He realized his life had been entirely in my hands. I controlled the environment perfectly. I controlled his fate. The authorities were mobilized. The trap was sprung. His empire burned. The thick dust settling over the concrete floor tasted like rust and victory. I stepped closer to the massive steel door. My heavy boots crunched rhythmically against the fractured debris. Bradley lay completely immobilized beneath the heavy industrial barricade. His expensive wool overcoat was wedged beneath the solid metal edge. It anchored him to the ground like an insect pinned to a display board. His manic energy had evaporated. It was replaced by a hyperventilating panic. He stared up at me with wide eyes. His chest was heaving as he struggled uselessly against the immense weight. He looked entirely defeated. The engineered trap had stripped away every ounce of his corporate arrogance. I stood directly over him. I blocked out the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the frosted windows. I did not speak immediately. I allowed the suffocating reality of his absolute failure to compress his lungs. He had orchestrated the murder of my daughter. He had tormented my granddaughter. He had attempted to steal my legacy. Now he was entirely at my mercy within a fortress of my own design. I crouched down slowly. My knee joints popped in the cold air. Bradley flinched in pure terror. He turned his face away and threw his free arm over his head. It was a desperate and cowardly attempt to shield himself from a physical blow. I had no intention of striking him. Violence was the tool of men who lacked intellect and patience. I reached down and firmly grabbed the lapel of his trapped coat. I pulled the fabric taut. I ignored his pathetic whimpers. I slid my right hand deep into the interior breast pocket of his jacket. My rough fingers brushed against cold and polished stone. I extracted the object and held it up right now. I brought it into the pale light. It was the solid jade bracelet belonging to Aaliyah. The vibrant green stone caught the faint illumination. It radiated a quiet and enduring beauty against the grim industrial backdrop of the workshop. Bradley had stolen it from her personal effects after the vehicular homicide. He had kept it as a morbid trophy of his successful extortion scheme. Holding it now felt incredibly profound. I felt the sharp edge of my grief temper into a cold and unbreakable resolve. The bracelet belonged to my family. It was the final piece to reclaim for us. I slipped the jade bracelet safely into my own pocket. I rested it against the external hard drive containing the digital evidence of his total destruction. I looked down into the terrified and tear-stained face of Bradley. I finally spoke. My voice was devoid of anger. It was perfectly leveled and resonant in the cavernous space. I told him that his ultimate downfall was not a product of bad luck or unfortunate timing. His destruction was the direct result of his own blinding and narcissistic arrogance. He had looked at me and seen nothing but a vulnerable old man. He saw a grieving target ripe for financial exploitation. He believed he could manipulate me through fear and emotional extortion. He fundamentally failed to understand the nature of the man he chose to attack. I told him he had made a fatal miscalculation by underestimating a veteran black structural engineer. I had spent 40 years calculating load distributions and identifying hidden weaknesses. I built physical foundations designed to withstand catastrophic pressure. I applied those exact same engineering principles to dismantle his life. I located the stress points in his extortion scheme and applied systematic pressure until everything collapsed completely tonight. His entire operation shattered under its own weight. I continued my measured address. I paced slowly around his trapped body. I pointed toward the matte black laptop resting on the wooden crate nearby. I told him he had made an equally fatal mistake by underestimating Evelyn. He assumed my late wife was simply a quiet mother who passed away in the background. He had no idea she was one of the most brilliant forensic auditors in the financial sector. Evelyn spent her entire professional career hunting corporate ghosts. She tracked hidden assets and destroyed complex military-grade digital firewalls flawlessly. She had recognized his fraudulent shell companies immediately. Before her heart finally gave out, she had meticulously engineered the decryption software designed to shatter his offshore architecture. Bradley had relied on digital shadows and complex algorithms to hide his involvement in the murder. He believed his money shielded him from consequence. I told him that an old black engineer built the physical cage that trapped him tonight, but a brilliant black woman built the digital weapon that would put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his miserable life. We had dismantled him together from beyond the grave. The heavy and suffocating silence of the workshop was suddenly broken. A faint and high-pitched wail drifted through the frosted glass windows. The sound originated miles away but grew louder. The wail was growing steadily closer and cutting through the quiet industrial district. It was the unmistakable pitch of police sirens. Multiple units were converging on our location. The automated transmission I triggered from the encrypted laptop had successfully mobilized the federal authorities. They had traced the signal directly to the East Side workshop. The local police and federal tactical units were swarming the sector without any further delay. Bradley heard the sirens. A fresh wave of sheer panic washed over his bloody and bandaged face. He resumed pulling frantically at his trapped arm. He was tearing the fabric of his expensive wool coat in a useless bid for freedom. He opened his mouth and began screaming for help. He was hoping the approaching officers would rescue him from the cold concrete floor. I did not move to silence him. His screams were irrelevant. The federal agents were arriving to arrest him for murder and not to offer him salvation. I turned my attention away from the pathetic man. I looked into the deep shadows near the side door. Victoria was huddled against the cold brick wall. She had watched the entire confrontation in absolute and paralyzed terror. She knew the federal authorities were seconds away from breaching the building. She looked up at me with eyes wide in desperate and animalistic fear. She was bracing for me to execute her or hand her directly to the approaching tactical teams. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the set of surrendered car keys. I walked across the debris-covered floor and stopped directly in front of her trembling frame. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply held out my hand and dropped her car keys onto the concrete at her feet. I told her to run. Victoria snatched the keys off the floor. She sprinted toward the rear exit of the workshop and burst out into the freezing night air. She threw herself into her luxury sedan and stomped on the accelerator. The vehicle shot forward into the darkness. She believed she had escaped my trap. She was wrong. Federal agents intercepted her vehicle down the road and took her into federal custody tonight. The wail of approaching sirens amplified until the deafening noise became a physical vibration against the corrugated steel walls of the workshop. Red and blue tactical lights pierced the frosted glass windows, casting frantic shadows across the concrete debris. The side door burst open under the coordinated impact of a federal breaching team. Armed agents swarmed into the cavernous space, their flashlights cutting through the settling dust. They swept the perimeter with lethal efficiency before their beams converged on the center of the room. They found Bradley exactly where I had left him. He was pinned to the concrete floor beneath 1,000 pounds of industrial steel. The agents forcefully extracted him from his ruined wool overcoat. They hauled him to his feet, slamming him against the brick pillar I had utilized as my fulcrum. The ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed sharply in the quiet building. A senior agent stood directly in front of him, reciting the Miranda rights with mechanical detachment. Bradley did not argue. He did not demand his attorney. He stared blankly at the floor, his reality completely shattered by the absolute certainty of his impending incarceration. He was escorted out of the building, shoved into the back of an armored transport vehicle, and driven away into the freezing night. The legal proceedings moved with devastating velocity. There were no lengthy delays or protracted negotiations. The evidence I extracted using Evelyn's software provided the district attorney with a bulletproof case. The Cybercrimes Division verified the authenticity of every digital file within 48 hours. The offshore ledgers, the falsified medical records, and the operational folders, explicitly labeled as the Aaliyah Project, painted a horrific, undeniable picture of premeditated murder. Victoria's capture on the highway further accelerated the timeline. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, she immediately accepted a comprehensive plea agreement. She turned state's evidence, testifying in granular detail about Bradley's extortion scheme and his financial links to Marcus Thorne. Her testimony corroborated the digital data, perfectly sealing Bradley's fate. His criminal defense attorneys attempted to suppress the laptop evidence, but the presiding federal judge dismissed their desperate motions entirely. While the justice system systematically dismantled his physical freedom, the financial architecture I had established years prior initiated its final protocol. The dead man's trust, the ironclad legal contingency I secretly built, formally activated the exact moment Bradley was indicted for Aaliyah's murder. The trust was expertly designed to act as an automated financial guillotine. It immediately bypassed the probate courts, severing Bradley from every single asset tied to my family. The legal execution was flawless and absolute. The trust formally seized control of the $5 million in commercial real estate and offshore funds that Bradley desperately attempted to launder. The money did not revert to me. The trust legally transferred the entire $5 million fortune directly into a highly secured financial portfolio entirely in Harper's name. Bradley's shell companies were liquidated. His offshore accounts were drained to absolute zero. His corporate holdings were dissolved. He had murdered my daughter and tortured my granddaughter for a massive financial empire that completely vanished into thin air the very second the federal handcuffs locked around his wrists. Harper was financially independent and permanently protected from the man who turned her childhood into a psychological prison. The sentencing hearing took place on a bitter Tuesday morning. The municipal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Federal agents and journalists filled the oak benches, eager to witness the final conclusion of the Aaliyah Project. I sat in the front row of the gallery, positioned directly behind the prosecution table. I wore a dark, meticulously tailored suit. I sat perfectly still, my posture rigid. I felt the heavy weight of Aaliyah's jade bracelet resting securely in my interior breast pocket. It was a silent, grounding reminder of the vibrant daughter I had lost and the justice I had engineered. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened. 2 armed bailiffs escorted Bradley into the chamber. The physical deterioration of the man was staggering. He wore a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his thinned frame. The commanding posture of the corporate executive was entirely gone. He shuffled toward the defense table with a defeated gait. The heavy steel chains binding his ankles rattled loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He sat down heavily, refusing to look at the gallery. The presiding judge entered the courtroom, her dark robes billowing as she took her seat behind the mahogany bench. She did not waste time with introductory pleasantries. She looked down at Bradley with an expression of profound judicial disgust. She stated that in her 30 years on the bench, she had never encountered a case of such calculated cruelty. She detailed his extensive crimes for the official record, outlining the orchestrated murder of his wife and the systemic torture of his daughter. She declared his actions demonstrated a complete absence of human empathy. She picked up her wooden gavel and delivered the final, irrevocable verdict. She sentenced Bradley to life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder. She struck the sounding block with a thunderous crack, sealing the tomb he would inhabit for the rest of his life. 2 months passed since the heavy steel door crashed against the concrete floor of the East Side Engineering Workshop. The violent echoes of that freezing night were entirely gone. I spent the intervening weeks meticulously restoring the cavernous space. I repaired the damaged overhead track system. I replaced the compromised retaining pins with forged titanium bolts. The massive industrial door now glided along its horizontal path with a smooth, perfectly calibrated silence. The workshop was no longer a makeshift tactical kill box designed to trap a desperate predator. It reverted to its original purpose. It became a sanctuary of creation logic and enduring structural integrity. I stood near the center workbench, wiping a thin layer of machine grease from my hands using a heavy canvas rag. The morning sunlight filtered through the large frosted upper windows, illuminating the floating dust motes in the warm air. I looked across the polished wooden surface of the drafting table. Harper sat on a high metal stool. She held a silver mechanical pencil. Harper looked completely unrecognizable from the terrified, shivering child trapped inside the Milton Estate attic. Her pale skin now held the healthy, vibrant flush of a child allowed to run freely in the sun. She wore a bright yellow summer dress and a pair of scuffed canvas sneakers. The heavy, restrictive medical masks were permanently thrown into the incinerator. The fabricated breathing exercises were entirely forgotten. She breathed the rich, oil-scented air of the workshop with deep, effortless lung capacity. She was currently studying a basic architectural blueprint I had drawn for a small wooden birdhouse. I watched her trace the load-bearing lines with intense concentration. She possessed the sharp visual memory of her mother and my innate understanding of structural balance. I never pushed her to learn. She gravitated toward the drafting table, naturally seeking order and logic after spending 8 years surviving inside a chaotic house of psychological mirrors. I walked over and tapped the corner of her blueprint. As Harper reached for a drafting compass, the heavy jade bracelet slipped down her forearm. The vibrant green stone caught the ambient light, radiating a quiet, enduring legacy. I had taken the bracelet directly from the trapped coat pocket and placed it where it rightfully belonged. It fit loosely on her small wrist, but she refused to take it off. It served as a constant physical connection to the mother she barely remembered but deeply loved. I smiled and told her it was time to pack up our tools for the morning. We had a scheduled appointment across town. Harper nodded immediately. She carefully rolled up the schematic paper and placed the silver pencil back into the leather holding case. The financial realities of our new life provided absolute security. The legal trust fund had executed perfectly. $5 million in recovered assets now sat inside an ironclad portfolio under her name. The stolen empire was completely repurposed to guarantee her future education, her health, and her absolute freedom. We walked out of the workshop together. I pulled the heavy steel door shut. It locked with a solid, satisfying metallic click. We climbed into the cab of my truck. The drive through the city was remarkably peaceful. The oppressive weight that had crushed my chest for the past year was entirely lifted. The federal penitentiary currently housed Bradley for the remainder of his natural life. Victoria was serving a lengthy sentence in a minimum security facility after exchanging her testimony for a plea deal. Marcus Thorne was permanently neutralized. The elaborate extortion ring was dismantled down to its very foundation. I navigated the familiar suburban streets, turning onto the winding tree-lined road that led toward the municipal cemetery. The weather was shifting. A layer of heavy gray clouds dominated the sky, threatening a late morning rain shower. I parked the truck near the wrought iron gates. Harper opened her door and stepped out onto the damp grass. We walked down the manicured stone pathway. We navigated through the rows of polished granite markers until we reached the quiet, shaded corner of the cemetery. We stopped in front of 2 pristine headstones resting side by side. The grave of Evelyn was marked by a simple, elegant marble block. The resting place of Aaliyah featured a carved stone angel. I stood silently before my wife and my daughter. I did not feel the agonizing, hollow despair that usually accompanied these visits. I felt a profound sense of completion. I had fulfilled the ultimate promise a father and a husband could make. I protected our surviving bloodline. Harper stepped forward and knelt on the soft grass between the 2 markers. She reached out and gently traced the engraved letters of the name belonging to her mother. The jade bracelet tapped softly against the granite surface. The sound was peaceful. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet greeting to the family she was finally allowed to embrace without fear. At that exact moment, the atmospheric pressure shifted. The heavy gray clouds directly above us fractured. A brilliant, piercing ray of golden sunlight broke through the overcast sky. The sudden illumination cascaded down, bathing the 2 headstones, and Harper in a warm, radiant glow. The vibrant green of the jade bracelet flared brilliantly in the direct sunlight. I stood back and watched the physical manifestation of peace settle over my granddaughter. The long, suffocating nightmare orchestrated by a greedy, narcissistic monster was definitively over. The darkness was banished. I crossed my arms over my chest and took a deep, unrestricted breath of the crisp morning air. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calmness. I allowed my mind to process the entirety of the long, grueling journey. I analyzed the tactical decisions that brought us to this exact moment of absolute tranquility. I reflected on the methodology of my retaliation. I had not allowed raw, unmitigated rage to dictate my actions. Blind fury is a chaotic and destructive force that ultimately consumes the person wielding it. If I had charged the Milton estate with a weapon, if I had yelled and threatened Bradley in the open, I would have triggered a fatal escalation. Bradley wanted a reactive emotional opponent. He expected a vulnerable, grieving old man to make tactical errors. I refused to grant him that satisfaction. I utilized the precise calculating intellect of a structural engineer. I analyzed his entire operation as if it were a flawed bridge. I identified the hidden stress fractures within his fraudulent empire. I mapped the exact vulnerabilities in his psychological armor. I executed a silent adjustment. I dismantled his defenses piece by piece without making a single sound. I utilized the brilliant digital legacy left behind by Evelyn to shatter his impenetrable firewalls. We destroyed the monster using patience logic and undeniable truth. The predator was permanently locked inside a steel cage. The innocent child was rescued from the freezing attic and brought into the light. I looked down at Harper. She turned to face me and smiled. I placed my hand on her shoulder. The structural integrity of our family was fully restored. We walked safely into a future that belonged to us. True power does not reside in explosive anger or chaotic retaliation against those who underestimate you. Real strength is found in the quiet application of intellect and patience. When faced with absolute betrayal, the most devastating response is a silent adjustment of circumstances. You must calculate the structural weaknesses of your enemies and dismantle their defenses without uttering a single threat. Vengeance is a temporary release. Securing the future of your family through strategic planning creates an unbreakable legacy. Ultimately, the single greatest victory is reclaiming your peace and building a fortress of love that no predator can ever destroy. Share your own stories of resilience and strategic victories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gripping conclusion, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to ensure you never miss another thrilling story. See you in the next video.